Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Henry Bailey, and I'll be chairing the session this afternoon. I'd like to say a great welcome to everyone, and to thank you for joining in. Yesterday we had some really awesome sessions, and I think most of us on our side are eagerly awaiting what is to come this afternoon. But before we get into that, let's have a word from our sponsors.
First is more than just a place at the top. To be first, you need determination, passion, commitment, compassion, resilience. These are the values that make us first citizens. First means leading with technology. First is the power to achieve your true potential. First means putting people above all else. Today, we are growing across the region. And the best is yet to come. First Citizens, we put you first.
Good. So thanks again to our sponsors for this session. So today, the proceedings we have three interesting components to the overall COTE meeting this year. Today we're going to start with a session on vulnerability and resilience under climate change and natural disasters, and then we're going to go on to a session that deals with policy, adaptation, and mitigation practices and challenges in small island developing states, which is hugely relevant to us. Anybody who's lived here for the past few weeks would find that resonates well with the times. And then we close off with a session of the chairs of the various sessions that we had, where they're going to be exploring the key takeaways from this year's COTE meeting. So our first session is the one on vulnerability and resilience under climate change and natural disasters. And the chair of that session is Ms. Malini Maraj. I've actually known Ms. Maraj for some time. I've never had the pleasure of introducing her before, but a quick look at her CV is pretty amazing, really. She's been on the campus for over 18 years. In various capacities of lecturer, instructor, teaching assistant, and so on. And she's also lectured in other tertiary institutions in Trinidad as well, including a few private tertiary education institutions and COSTAT. Most of her teaching is in microeconomics and some interesting advanced subjects like the history of economic thought, environmental economics, the economics of natural disasters and climate change. I think I first met Malini in that capacity when she was with Professor Panton on the whole climate change agenda. She's also had an impressive track record in consultancy and in various capacities on campus. As well. She's worked with the IDB, with the World Bank, EMA, and so on and so forth. So there's a long list of organizations and accomplishments. So with that, let me introduce Ms. Maraj to take the first session, and I'll be back with you again at the end of that. Malini?
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. Good afternoon to our participants, to our panelists that are joining us this afternoon. I am pleased to be the chair of this panel on vulnerability and resilience under climate change and natural disasters. And I was listening to the word from our sponsors, and it stood out to me that one of the words that they shared was that of resilience. You know, becoming a resilient individual was part of what they were suggesting as being necessary. And I think it speaks to who we are as a Caribbean, and one of the characteristics that we need to pay further attention to, becoming resilient in light of our vulnerabilities. We define ourselves in particular based on our inherent characteristics. You know, we are small, in most cases, islands. We have small economies, we're very open, and the past couple of years, particularly with COVID-19, would have highlighted a lot of our vulnerabilities and our ability to recover from that speaks to our resilience. And in terms of climate change and natural disasters, it is not new to our region that we have to learn to adapt, we have to learn to become more resilient. And I think today's panelist speaks to that necessity, to that criteria with regard to becoming more sustainable nations, more sustainable economies. And with that, you know, I look forward to the discussions after we have our panelists present. Joining us today, we have Ms. Kiana Bowen, Mr. Jesse Williams, Dr. Graham King, and Professor Michelle Maiku. To start today's panel on vulnerability and resilience under natural disasters and climate change, I would like to invite Ms. Kiana Bowen, who would be presenting on a gendered approach to climate change resilience in the Caribbean. Just to give you some background about Ms. Kiana Bowen, she currently serves as the United Nations Women Multi-Country Office Caribbean Project Manager for the Enabling Gender Responsive Disaster Recovery, Climate and Environmental Resilience in the Caribbean. And it's appropriately abbreviated as ENGENDER. Ms. Bowen is a graduate from the University of the West Indies with a master's degree in urban and regional planning and a bachelor's in social work. Ultimately, Ms. Bowen is aiming to highlight the link between stakeholder and beneficiary input into physical planning as a mechanism to build disaster resilient communities through policy and plan development. With that, let me introduce Ms. Kiana Bowen to join our session and to share her presentation. Ms. Bowen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, and can you see my presentation?
Yes, we are seeing your presentation, Ms. Bowen.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiana Bowen, and I am the Program Officer, Humanitarian Climate Change and Disaster Risk Resilience with the UN Women Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean. In my presentation today, I'm going to share a bit on our gendered approach to strengthen climate change resilience across the Caribbean region. Let's start with the disaster risk formula that many of us may be familiar with. At the onset, this equation does not automatically outline gender vulnerabilities nor gender inequalities. However, gender inequalities do manifest themselves within the resilience and coping capacity elements of the equation. When taking a closer look at the comprehensive disaster management cycle, which is presented on the image to the left, we can see that the impact from disasters is gender neutral. Disasters affect each and every one of us differently, and these impacts can also be experienced through our socioeconomic conditions, our cultural beliefs, and even our traditional practices in some cases that vary across country to country. For instance, there are the social and cultural norms where men are expected to be the heads of households and therefore return to work easier after disaster impact. However, this can result in women bearing the burden of unpaid domestic work within the home. Hence, a gender transformative disaster reduction approach for us here in the Caribbean cannot remain business as usual. The flow chart to the far right highlights that we must now take into account the UN Sustainable Development Goals and even the targets within the SEDIMA's regional framework for the Caribbean. The Engender project is our flagship project at this time, which seeks to strengthen gender-responsive climate change across 9 beneficiary countries. To quickly mention, Engender is funded by Global Affairs Canada, as well as the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, and is being implemented by 4 agencies, UNDP as lead agency, with WFP, SEDIMA, as well as UN Women also implementing activities under the project. To date, UN Women has been able to champion a number of studies across the 9 project countries. These 3 studies, as presented in that order from left to right, focused on a gender analysis as it relates to the capacity of persons to prepare for, respond to, and even recover from climate change impacts. You can feel free to access these studies by using the QR codes throughout my presentation, as well as you can visit our website for the additional policy briefs on the gendered impacts of climate change for the remaining 8 countries. The first of these studies focused on the status of women and men in COVID-19. Yes, we can certainly agree that COVID-19 is not a climate change related hazard. However, should there have been a climate change impact, the vulnerabilities of marginalized groups that would have been exacerbated given the fallouts that the pandemic brought about. This slide also provides a summary of the results of the COVID-19 study. As observed, there was a significant increase in unpaid care work for women, as I would have made reference to before. And this increase in burden for unpaid care work meant that women had less time available to generate income and engage in educational activities, which could have further possibly limit their recovery opportunities and by extension lead to increasing rates of poverty in the medium to long term, should there have been a climate change impact. The second body of research involved a knowledge, attitudes, practices, and behavior study, which we call the CAP study for short. This study focused on the capacity of senior technical officers in climate change mandatory agencies to be able to apply a gender-responsive approach to climate change. Generally, respondents indicated that while they understand the importance of gender, they do not feel that they have the capacity to mainstream gender into their various areas of work. Our third study entailed the examination of gender inequality and climate change of disaster risk for each of the 9 Engender project countries. What was really unique about this study is that it not only examined gender inequalities, but it also took into consideration what the coping mechanisms were through focus group discussions, etc., to understand what those vulnerabilities are. Our research confirmed that most vulnerable groups included small-scale business owners, such as craft vendors and fishers that engage in a number of self-reliance livelihoods. These people particularly rely on their savings and loans to navigate the impacts from disasters as well as climate change events. In fact, we have noted that the tourism sector is a critical livelihood for women-headed households in some Caribbean countries. This places a significant number of women at risk of financial instability when there's a disaster impact. One coping mechanism identified in the studies was that women are often forced to turn to private lenders, which potentially put them at greater financial risk due to higher interest rates, as well as unrealistic expectations for the repayment of any loans taken. Regarding the impact on livelihoods in particular from climate change events, we've also observed instances in delays in social security payments, as well as other social service disruptions, which can place people at a further disadvantage. In one case, to give an example, it was noted that no alternatives were made for women who received child support payments through the courts during the time of government business closures during the pandemic. Yes, as I mentioned before, the pandemic is not a climate change related event. However, should there have been a natural hazard impact during the pandemic, single women-headed households would have been placed more at risk. So when we're looking into income generation and skills training as it relates to climate resilience, we need to ensure that our women and men are in positions where they are resilient and that our industries in particular are also resilient. If all women are housekeepers or the majority of women are working in the tourism sector, and of course, this is not necessarily the case, I'm giving an example. If the majority of women working in the tourism sector are housekeepers, and they are the first to be let off after climate hazard impact, what does that mean for the ability to generate income in this instance? These are the things that we must be thinking about. So we have collected all this fantastic data. And what have we done? UN Women has been able to mobilize direct livelihood support in response to the COVID-19 impact for over 2,000 women across 8 project countries. This allowed for an injection into small businesses in an attempt to provide a safety net should a climate change event occur. We also took the opportunity to strengthen capacity in the area of gender-based violence, given the reported increase of domestic violence during the peak of the pandemic in particular. We've also placed significant emphasis on behavior change as it relates to raising awareness on the gender inequality and climate change nexus. And finally, earlier this year, we were able to launch another Status of Women and Men report, but this one focused on innovating financing for empowerment of all groups within the context of climate change resilience. This report is particularly interesting as it provides specific mechanisms that can be applied to our Caribbean context. And this brings me to the end of my presentation today. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'm also taking the opportunity to invite you to register to our upcoming event at COP27. This event is being held in collaboration with the Caribbean Development Bank, and I do believe that this session on gender lens financing for climate change will be definitely an interesting conversation. Thank you, and I hand back over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bowen. So we are introducing the topic of vulnerability, and I think Ms. Bowen was quite succinct in terms of highlighting the fact that natural disasters and climate change has different impacts on different people. And I look forward to the questions as we continue with the presentations. And I do hope that you take note of the work that is being done by Ms. Bowen and the Agenda Project. Next, we have Mr. Jesse Williams, who is a PhD candidate in agricultural economics with a focus in environmental economics. His research areas include environmental valuation methods and vulnerability assessments. An individual with a passion for all things related to agriculture and research. The paper that Mr. Williams would be presenting on is called Assessing Vulnerabilities to Climate Change in Trinidad and Tobago Using Rapid Vulnerability Assessment. With this, I'd like to ask Mr. Williams to please join us and share your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, good day. Thank you for the introduction, Chair. And I'll now go to share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesse Williams, and I'll be presenting on behalf of myself and Dr. Sharon Hutchinson from the Department of Agricultural Economics and Extension. Today, I'll be presenting on the topic, Assessing Vulnerabilities to Climate Change in Trinidad and Tobago Using a Rapid Vulnerability Assessment. So before any research starts, there must be a background into why to undertake this research. On the global agenda, climate change is at the forefront of most discussions at the multilateral level. The effects of climate change are systemic, that is, not only natural resources are affected, but climate change has an impact on those who depend on such natural resources. What is the relevance of all this for Trinidad and Tobago? Well, in 2017, our Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries released a statement that provoked some thoughts. And I would like to quote an excerpt from the statement to elucidate this. Climate change is modifying the distribution and production of marine and freshwater species. The consequences of sustainability of aquatic ecosystems for fisheries and aquaculture and for the people that depend on them are uncertain. The very livelihood of coastal communities are threatened, and they will bear the major fallout if systems are not put in place to reverse climate change. And they have also noted that research has shown that there is already overfishing in our waters, particularly in the Gulf. Thus, the need to understand the impact that climate change has on livelihoods and food security must be addressed. The FAO, which is one of the leaders in our field, in its publication addressing the climate change and poverty nexus, sets the approach in achieving such. Mainstreaming climate change in pro-poor or social policies is heavily encouraged, and vulnerability assessments are the building blocks to address this nexus. That is the nexus between climate change, well, the interrelationship between climate change, poverty, and food security. So we need to scope the literature to know the work that has been done and to lead the research into the vulnerability assessment that we undertook. Some key points from the literature are that socioeconomic factors are important in conducting vulnerability assessments. Climate change and its impacts on the socioeconomic landscape can be complex. Therefore, there's an urgent need to develop mitigation and adaptation strategies suited to the local context. Vulnerability in the climate change context usually refers to three components, that is, adaptive capacity, exposure, and sensitivity. FAO and CANARI have developed a toolkit for vulnerability and capacity assessments in Caribbean coastal and fishing communities. And so what this research, the research that we are undergoing, is a rapid vulnerability assessment, and this was provided for in the toolkit developed by FAO and CANARI. And of course, the framework of analysis in this rapid vulnerability assessment, we opted to use the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. And the community that we currently undertaking the research is Orange Valley. And this community was chosen because, one, it is a coastal community. Two, it is a fishing community. And therefore, there are many vulnerabilities that, by the fact itself, exist in the community. So the search questions are, what is the vulnerability context of residents in Orange Valley? What are the factors that affect vulnerability? What systems or strategies do households have in place to deal with the effects of climate change? And here we have the methodology. The rapid vulnerability assessment was conducted using the tools such as hazard trend analysis, through a workshop and semi-structured interviews through focus groups. The sample was purposefully selected to highlight different segments of the population, for example, young adults and women. And we worked in conjunction with the Orange Valley Village Council to execute the research. So we have garnered some preliminary results thus far. By and large, the exercise was successful and yielded interesting results for policymakers. The engagement workshop with the community revealed the increasing level of vulnerability to climate change over the years, particularly the elements of exposure and sensitivity. For example, it was noted that one of their cultural assets, which was a temple in the sea close by, was damaged from a storm surge in 2018. There have also been increasing incidents of flooding, especially in parts of the community that were not prone to flooding before. And there has been an invasion of different species of fish in the area. Non-climatic hazards were also reported, such as the invasion of the giant African snail, which has been causing damage to some natural assets in the community. The inward migration of non-nationals has also affected the social makeup and, by extension, the social asset of community spirit and cohesiveness to some extent. And lastly, because I know time is of the essence, the community is still reeling from the closure of Carney 1975 Limited, and incomes have been lost. But on the bright side, since the closure of Carney 1975, there has been more biodiversity in the area. And the focus groups, the concept of poverty came to the fore, and what is important to note about this concept is that poverty is not only about income, but there are many dimensions to poverty, particularly in the areas of health, education, and living standards.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Just quickly, if you can wrap up, and I'm sure we can continue during the discussion session. Sure.
Interesting adaptation strategies were that there's always a stock of fish that is kept frozen, and this is used as a food source when there's little to no catch, and reclamation of land in the jetty area to combat rise in sea level. What it shows that is that the community is heavily reliant on fishing as a source of income and sustenance. Therefore, intervention is needed in this aspect. And whilst persons are generally food secure, there seems to be relative poverty in the area as well as instances of transient poverty, and this should be looked at. So in conclusion, the FAO has issued a clarion call to address the climate change poverty nexus. Yes, numerous studies in Trinidad have been previously done, but only evaluating parts of the nexus at a time. And the novelty that this research will bring would be to embed climate change into poverty assessments in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Williams. And as I said, I'm looking forward to the participants' questions so that during our question and answer session, we can actually delve deeper into this study on vulnerability assessment. So with that, I would like to move on to our third panelist, Dr. Graham King. Dr. Graham King will be presenting on a study, a paper that has a quite interesting topic. It is called Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, Growth by Innovating Our Way to Resilience and Adaptation. Dr. King is the director of the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of the West Indies. With a passion for innovation and university-industry collaboration, Dr. King brokers industry-based projects, sits on the boards of Kariri and Arrive Alive, and is a member of the TTMA Productivity Committee and the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Chamber Decarbonization Task Force. As part of his current role, Dr. King is chair of the St. Augustine Innovation Committee, the St. Augustine Intellectual Properties Subcommittee, and sits on the board of the UWI's Ventures Limited and other UE spin-out companies. As project lead on the 4.2 million euro HIT Reset project funded by the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, EU, he is actively considering issues of innovation and resilience in coastal communities. So I see Dr. King is very eager to present, and with that, I would like to introduce you to begin. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thanks, Melanie. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. So without further ado, let me just jump straight into it. We are in the midst of, I think, all of us will be aware of this massive and inevitable transitions in global society. There are transitions in the political system with very strong dynamic of polarization in the political systems. There's a climate transition taking place. I think we could almost go beyond calling it climate change now, because we have to recognize that we're now transitioning to a new climate. And there's lots of shifts associated with that. We have a huge transition that we call the digital transformation. And also we have an energy transition that's taking place where the structure of our energy systems is being completely redeveloped. And that's also associated with that is the transformation of the transportation sector. And all of these are linked actually and interplay very closely with each other. And transition is moving from one state to another. And so when you're talking about transition and economies and the ways of life transitioning, that means that we are doing new things in a new way. New things in a new way. And whenever we start talking about newness, like that, you have to be talking about innovation. And so innovation capacity is the key to successful transition. Of course, in our context in the Caribbean, we're home to a lot of non-resilient coastal communities and other non-coastal communities, but because we're dominated by small island states, then a large proportion of our population lives within a few kilometers of the coast and could really be effectively described as coastal communities. And our infrastructure is also very vulnerable to coastal issues. The bottom there is Tobago's airport. You can see it's right on the coastline. So a bunch of different coastal considerations. This is just showing this a paper by Professor Winston Moore and Stephanie Pascal. They wrote this for the CBB, the Central Bank of Barbados, reporting on the impact of COVID on small island states. And they stated that job losses could have been reduced if there were two things: one, improved ease of doing business, and two, more firm level innovation. So in other words, if we are faced, and of course that's, as the previous presenter said, this is not a climate crisis, but COVID-19 is a hugely disruptive sort of crisis that hit the whole earth. And the conclusion here is you can deal with crises if you have, let's say, systematized innovation. But in the region, we don't spend much on R&D. Now, R&D and innovation are inextricably linked together, and a good measure of the innovation capacity of a nation state or a region is the spend per capita on our R&D activities, research and development activities. And you can see that right up at the top is Singapore, And right down at the bottom in this chart is the Caribbean small states. So compared to other territories around the world, we spend very little now. This isn't total amount spent, this is per capita. So in other words, it's not only that we're not spending much, but we're not spending much per person. So our level of investment is very, very low. These are some benchmarks in terms of how much is spent on R&D. Israel's tops it out at about 5%, Korean Republic about 4%, South Korea. United States is in the middle, around 2.8%, but we know the United States economy is an innovation-driven economy. Singapore, 1.9%, Lithuania, 1%, but right down at 0.1% is the Caribbean. And if we're talking Trinidad and Tobago, it's even less than that. So our best estimates, and unfortunately the Central Statistical Office doesn't carry these data or the input data that we need to really effectively assess this. But the best estimate really is that we're in the sort of 0.05% to 0.08% spend on R&D per capita. And that is absolutely diabolical. And it's at least 10 times less than we need to be investing in R&D, even to be vaguely in the game in terms of becoming an innovation-based economy. And just to re-emphasize the point I made, that our ability to respond to crises, climate crises, pandemics, whatever type of crisis it might be, or even to those transitions which you looked at before, is dependent on our investment in and the inculcation of an innovation-based economy. So we do need to boost our innovation spending. You don't get innovation if you don't invest in it. Innovation is very expensive, but it has big rewards. So innovation requires stable government financing. It requires more aggressive firm-level private sector investment. And I think that's actually a glaring absence in our economy, not just the government not putting money in, but the private sector isn't investing in R&D. And part of the reason for that is the way in which our economies have historically been structured as commodity-based economies. And I would even include tourism as a commodity in that respect, although it's not purely, obviously, a commodity, it's a service, but it has certain elements that are reflective of a commodity economy as well. And we also need to be very smart in the way in which we as a region, as economies in the region, use the external agency support of the development banks, the European Union, and the massive funds that are now being established for dealing with climate response and resilience, like the GCF. So I think smart use of these external agencies is important. We don't want the narrative to be dictated by the money that comes from these grant financing agencies and loan financing agencies. But at the same time, we need to use that money and use it in a very smart way to combine with what we as a region have as our agenda to move forward. For climate mitigation and especially resilience, focus spending on well-tested indigenous solutions. So there's, of course, a great risk or a kind of instinctive response to import solutions from elsewhere, which can be expensive and maybe not customized to our specific needs, but indigenous solutions is really where we need to be spending money so that we don't just solve the problem, but we're building our own economy and building our own capacity in doing it. And for that, we do need an innovation ecosystem. We need a system that inculcates this innovation capacity. And so this is just sort of identifying some of the elements. An ecosystem has many elements that interact and communicate and flow in and out of each other. But we need things like funding sources. We need, of course, the research activity. We need support organizations, customers, and startups. This is how innovation works, a very simplified innovation process, starting with opportunity, concept, validation, deployment, and develop and deploy. So we have an innovation process. So the University of the West Indies has created its own innovation ecosystem that it's using internally, but also that we want to be able to extend and integrate more effectively across the region. And there's a project called Hit Reset, which is mentioned in the bio, which supports the establishment of this innovation ecosystem through the empowerment and financing of innovators. And in this project, we are actually competitively awarding grants for the development of these innovative projects so that we can stimulate that level of national systems of innovation. So just two quick examples to wrap up. These are not funded by Hit Reset, but these are good examples of how innovation is being applied to respond to climate challenges. This one from Belize Belize has started to use this very tall grass called Arundo donax, which naturally occurs in Belize, to use the biomass for power generation that can reduce the amount of power that has to be imported from Mexico, reduce the Belize foreign exchange expenditure. And this is another very important one. There's work being done to mitigate carbon or to carbon sequestrate through renewal and regeneration of mango forests and mango projects. So this one is being done in Jamaica and is work that's restoring the mangrove ecosystems because they have very substantial carbon sinks, and they also provide resilience in terms of buffering for incoming storms and that kind of thing. So there's innovation in both in carbon capture measurement and in the business model in these. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm being told time's up. So whistle-stop tour through innovation.
Thank you, Dr. King. And I would like to thank you for your presentation. Before we invite any more questions from our participants, I would just like to indicate that Professor Michel Maikou is unable to join us due to some extenuating circumstances. So we can open the floor at this moment for questions. Our team is awaiting any questions that may appear on our chat, and we would address them to our panelists. Now, while we're awaiting those questions to come in, I'd just like to highlight something and perhaps open a discussion amongst our panelists in terms of the roles of institutions in vulnerability. Dr. King highlighted innovation, and I remember reading recently a study that sort of highlighted the differences in vulnerabilities between developing countries, particularly small island developing states. And we see that size, while it is a constraint, is not necessarily a key vulnerability that will affect development. In fact, in some cases, I think size being smaller can be an opportunity. And with that, we see different levels of resilience being built in small island developing states, such as Malta or Singapore. I think one of the panelists had mentioned. And my question to Dr. King and perhaps the other panelists is, what are the roles of institutions in facilitating resilience, particularly where we have a common set of vulnerabilities? How do you see institutions creating that opportunity for us to overcome these vulnerabilities? I'd start with Dr. King.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think institutions are incredibly important, and having functional institutions as well. And I think there is a balance that needs to be struck in as much as institutions, if we're talking, I mean, government institutions or let's say, well, either government institutions and government agencies or non-governmental organizations, what those entities are kind of really supposed to do is to create an environment in which individual innovators and entrepreneurs can create solutions that can work in let's say, indigenous solutions that can work in specific situations. But of course, also if the idea has merit or has, let's say, kind of credibility for further development, then to create a space, to create a conducive environment in which that idea could actually be commercialized on a broader scale, therefore generating potential income, kind of export income for the region. So the institutions are very important, but they have to understand their function. And I think institutions can create or could almost sort of disempower the capacity of the region to respond if they're too dominant in the space, instead of really looking to empower those that are supposed to benefit from what they do.
Thank you, Dr. King. Ms. Bowen, same question, but from a gender perspective, to what extent do we have or do we lack institutions within the region that will facilitate encompassing that gender dimension when making decisions, particularly with regard to climate change and natural disasters?
Thank you for that question. From my experience with the Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean, our focal points in terms of entry points in dealing with marginalized groups are what we call the national gender machineries. And most of those national gender machineries serve as gender affairs divisions or ministries of social development in some instances. And what we have found is that collaboration with those institutions have been quite useful because they are very aware in terms of the vulnerable populations that exist across the countries, the various countries and sectors. We also found that those national gender machineries also have close relationships, not only with social development agencies, but also their national disaster offices in some cases. So in the aftermath of an immediate impact, they are easily able to identify what priority needs are. For example, right now we are supporting the humanitarian efforts in Belize, given the impact of Hurricane Lisa. She upgraded to a hurricane recently. And what we are doing now is working through those government institutions in terms of understanding what are the priority needs for those vulnerable communities who have been impacted, and not only providing humanitarian relief in that immediate response, but what can a long-term aftermath, longer plan look like in terms of building resilience going forward? Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Ms. Bowen. We have a question to Mr. Jesse Williams, a specific questions to you, Mr. Williams, and that is, what is the extent of traction in the community in which you're researching on the issue of climate change and the extent to which climate change might impact their livelihoods? And if I recall, this was Orange Valley. Yes.
Okay.
So, Ms. Williams, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Answer the question. Well, from my understanding, what I mean by traction, I believe that when we delved into the community, yes, people had an understanding of climate change, but it was pretty rudimentary in the sense that at first they couldn't connect the climate change to poverty and to food security. So definitely we need more traction and more education and more awareness on the ground in the community, and by and large, the whole country in terms of the nexus, that critical nexus of climate change, poverty, and food security. With respect to the second part of the question, the extent to which climate change might impact livelihoods, I would like to dovetail from Ms. Bowen's presentation, where she said something very critical, and it concludes that a lot of the studies being done is that climate change exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. But what could happen in the community is that we know that we have fish migration in the community. This could be due to over-exploitation and possibly climate change. We don't know. The scientists on their side will have to go into the community and test the areas around the water to see, well, whether they have how much carbon in the water and whatnot that could possibly contribute. And carbon does through emissions, right? And some of it could enter into our seas as well as into the atmosphere. So that is one of the impacts of climate change. So the scientists will need to do some follow-up work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I think, it would be interesting to really explore the experiences of different communities, because there is a lot to be learned at the grassroots level we have our academics who would, perform research and collect data and make suggestions. But there is quite a lot that is being executed right now in response to climate change and natural disasters with our farmers, with our fishermen. And I think what you're speaking to here with regard to the experience of Orange Valley would really be informative to help us further understand that, climate change may not be well understood. And sometimes, while we may assume that everyone appreciates the impacts that it would have, that at the grassroots level, they are the ones who are experiencing it. And we need to really learn a lot from those communities in terms of how they are responding and how they are also impacted, because we can study it, but we may not really understand that extent of impact. There is one final question that we would like to pose to the team. And this is, what is your definitions of vulnerability? From some readings, I've come across the fact that vulnerability is multidimensional. When we measure vulnerability, we can look at an economic dimension. So there are measures of economic vulnerability, measures of social vulnerability, and then environmental vulnerability. And in terms of climate change and natural disasters, it is not simply just an environmental issue, as we're highlighting here in this conference on the economy. It takes many dimensions in terms of social, economic, and environmental impacts. So for our panelists, is there a particular definition of vulnerability that you are concerned about, that you are treating with? Is this definition international definition, or is it one that is a local definition in terms of reflective of the community, in your case, Mr. Williams, or in terms of the region, Mr. King, Dr. King and Ms. Bowen? Is that definition specific to our region, or is it a general definition that you're relying on? So I'll start with Dr. King.
Well, I'm not really an expert on these kind of terms and so on, but I think the definition I would be working with is vulnerability being the inability of a system or people to deal with the effects of climate change in this case, or any other disaster or crisis that comes on them. So I think that means that you kind of then steer when you're talking about helping vulnerable systems and vulnerable people to deal better, it's like, how do you now strengthen them, give them tools in their toolkit to be able to respond to the situations that come.
Thank you, Dr. King. Ms. Bowen, is there a particular dimension of vulnerability? I know from the gender perspective, we can highlight the economic dimension, inequalities, the social dimension in terms of the roles as well. But is there a specific definition that you are relying on here?
Yes, for us at UN Women, we must rely on that definition provided by the United Nations, particularly the Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, and that also extends to the physical, social, economic, and environmental factors that you would have made mention to. However, what we have noticed from our gender analysis studies that I've shared is that as disasters impact each and everyone differently, our vulnerabilities according to sex, gender, age, ethnicity for us here in the Caribbean, religion, they are all different in terms of what we are exposed to, how we live our daily lives, for example, and the uniqueness of being in the Caribbean region. If there's a climate change hazard impact, what are we vulnerable to? We are very close to the coast. We are coastal communities in most islands around the region, and that makes it inevitable for us to be able to not be impacted by a sea level rise or inland flooding event, for example. So it just depends on what that vulnerability is according to our sex and by age, and be able to always remain conscious and aware of that. Over.
Thank you, Ms. Bowen. Mr. Williams, in your experience with Orange Valley, that community, what did you rely on in terms of identifying what characteristics of that area were vulnerable?
Right, well, we relied on the definition provided by the toolkit, which was done by Afeo and Canary, which echoed the IPCC's definition of vulnerability. That is, people's exposure to climate change, their sensitivity to climate change, and their adaptive capacity to climate change, those three elements.
All right. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists and invite our participants to stay tuned and remain with us as we go through this evening's proceedings. Moving on to session 4, which is addressing policy, adaptation, mitigation practices, and challenges in small island developing states. Our 5th session would present an opportunity for further discussion into today's presentations and overall the messages coming out of this year's conference on the economy. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists for their interesting presentations and hand you over back to our chair, Dr. Henry Bailey. Dr. Bailey.
Okay, I'd like to also say a hearty thank you to that entire panel as well. Some interesting ideas coming out of that, and I thought that combination of the innovation, gender, and the Orange Valley discussion was interesting. Putting the three things together in one discussion. So thanks very much, Malini. World class as usual. And we turn now to the next session, policy, adaptation, and mitigation practices and challenges in SIDS. And I used to actually I've known Marlene for some time, our next speaker. And when I used to work at the business school at Lockjack, and used to bring Dr. Atz to come in and talk to us about exactly this, actually, about policy, adaptation, and mitigation practices. I remember the discussions well, and I know over the years the content has become even deeper, more interesting, and perhaps more frightening as we go along. We know more, but I don't know that we're any better off than we were back in the day. And I guess we'll hear some of that now. Dr. Marlene Atz is very, very well known in this arena. She's been a lecturer in the Department of Economics since 1998. I didn't know that. She's been primarily involved with sustainable development, and Dr. Atz really also came into this with Professor Panton as well. That's what she has in common with Malini. She's consulted with many regional and international organizations, including CDB, UNDP. She's been on the Economic Development Advisory Board. She's been the chairman of the National Productivity Council and the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. She's a board member on a couple of private sector companies as well. And she's also well known for being on TV talking about the budget. So she's a kind of a Marvel comic superhero when it comes to what we're doing here. So Marlene, I hand over to you. I'm looking forward to this session as well.
Thank you, Henry. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, I want to compliment my department for hosting this year's COTE on the issue of climate change and natural disasters. I mean, it couldn't be at a better time, given what is happening in the world and given that COP27 starts next week. You know, there is a lot to be said. A lot has been said within recent years about climate change and about climate change impacts on small island developing states. And I am hoping as we continue in this penultimate session for COTE 2022, for us to unearth some of the policy issues related to climate change, adaptation, climate change mitigation. A lot has been said in terms of our national budget, in terms of renewable energy and that transition. It is interesting. And again, I want to commend Henry and the organizing team for the flow of the conversation, because this session segues almost perfectly from the previous session where they were talking. I noted Graham's conversation, Dr. King's conversation around the need for us to have innovation, for us to help build resilience. And I think that is an important conversation. And I wanted to ask Graham about the National Innovation Policy, but I figured I wouldn't go down that road. We can always have that as a sidebar in terms of the conversation. So it is my honor and privilege to chair this session, to be the moderator for this particular session. And I am really very heartened and pleased, because what is happening this afternoon, almost fortuitously, it showcases that the University of the West Indies, we have been on top of research that is relevant for us in small and developing states, relevant for us in the Caribbean. So I am very happy to be joined by 4 presenters, all of whom are graduates of University of the West Indies, primarily St. Augustine, but also from the Mona campus, but UWI nonetheless, one UWI family. So I would like to begin by introducing the first speaker, Leah Wright. Leah is going to speak on the Caribbean response to disasters and insight into the role of transportation. And by way of an introduction, she describes herself as a youthful, of course I like that introduction, youthful and dynamic civil engineer with a BSc in civil engineering. And she's also now reading her PhD, specializing in transportation engineering. She's a final year candidate reading her PhD. Her scope of study for her PhD is on mode choice modeling and SIDS, with the ultimate objectives of a modernized and improved public transportation system with more efficient commutes and causing a modal shift in the island to help reduce traffic congestion. And of course, with that reduction in traffic congestion, it will be a reduction in emissions. Her contribution to the field of transportation engineering is also evident by her professional endeavors as a research assistant in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here on campus. And her areas of research have been travel behavior in SIDS, public transportation, and discrete choice modeling. She has also assisted in tutoring on the topic of discrete choice models at the St. Augustine campus. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Leah Wright to make her presentation for us this afternoon. And I will introduce the other candidates, the other presenters in turn. Over to you, Leah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Ash just said, my presentation today would be the Caribbean's response to disaster management with a specific look into the role of transportation. Now, based on the conversations we've been having, I know most of us here have experienced or know someone personally who has dealt with some kind of natural disaster. And the best example we know is hurricanes, because that really affects us here in the Caribbean. And I mean, we generally know when we're talking about a hurricane, the things that we need to do to prepare for hurricanes. You know, they'd say, make sure you have batteries, make sure you have clean water, and in the event of how bad the hurricane is, make sure you know where your closest shelter is in case you need to evacuate. But we also need to think about, how do we go about evacuating? Many times we tend to look at the resource side of things instead of looking at how do we achieve these things? How do we get resources to people that need them? How do we evacuate? We seldom look at transportation other than clearing of debris off of the roads, or if it's a bad hurricane, repairing the roads. But there's so much more that transportation can be used for as it relates to pre, during, and after a natural disaster that we have not looked at here in the Caribbean. And that's what I want to talk about today. How do we go about having a structured plan to save lives and to deal with resources in the event of a natural disaster here in the Caribbean? So the IPCC 2021 report indicated that the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events has likely increased on a global scale. Not only that, but with an increase in global warming, these types of events are likely to further increase as well as their intensity. This is an eye-opening piece of information. And what it really says is that us here in the Caribbean, we need to start taking a closer look at disaster management in the event of these kind of things. Disaster management planning is integral in the continued success and development for small island developing states and other Caribbean islands. And we know for a fact that here in the Caribbean, we are particularly vulnerable as we are exposed to a lot of these natural disasters, such as, like I mentioned before, hurricanes, severe flooding. That's something that we've all experienced in the last couple of weeks, earthquakes, and more recently in our neighboring island of St. Vincent, volcanic activities. These types of events have undoubtedly increased throughout the last decade or so, as shown by this graph here. And this has caused over $43 billion in damages and left more than 23,000 people homeless. Developing a comprehensive disaster management plan requires preparation and collaboration with many industries and disciplines. However, transportation is seldom part of that conversation for nothing more than clearing of debris off the road or just repairing the roads. Transportation service is a pivotal service in many countries, and it can enhance the economic and social growth of a country. But in the event of a natural disaster, these kinds of services can be disrupted, and depending on the severity of that disaster, the amount of time that it takes to repair this service is undefined, leaving a lot of persons stranded and vulnerable. It is quite possible to introduce transportation into every step of the disaster management system, and I think it's something that needs to be done. It is my opinion that the efficiency of existing disaster management plans here within the Caribbean could be greatly improved by strategically incorporating transportation planning. And by doing this, we can reduce evacuation and recovery time in the event of a natural disaster. So in this presentation today, I'm going to go through a review of some existing disaster management plans in a couple of Caribbean countries, and specifically looking at the role that transportation plays, if any. And then I'm going to be looking at some key elements that I think are necessary for the future design of transportation planning, disaster management planning here in the Caribbean. So the first island that we're going to look at is Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and finally, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the reality is that though all of these countries have their own disaster management plan, transportation is not really discussed. St. Lucia is the only island that I have looked at that actually has a separate transportation committee as well as a supplemental transportation plan to accommodate their supporting transportation plan. But for the most part, the discussion is typically around the clearing of debris on roads or the repairing of roads. And even sometimes you will see them talking about transporting important persons in the event of such a natural disaster. Even though transportation is not largely talked about in the Caribbean as it relates to disaster management, it is an area that can be improved and requires more focus to sustainably and substantially strengthen our existing disaster management plans. Now, in the essence of time, I'm not going to go through every step here today, but there are some key elements that I think need to be included in the framework. But just like I said, in the essence of time, we're going to be discussing multimodal policies, travel demand models, and then finally the guidebook for the Caribbean. Now, the first one, looking at multimodal policies, a lot of transportation evacuation plans tend to look at evacuation from a single car perspective, but this is not the most effective means of evacuating people. In fact, this can lead to increasing congestion and an increase in evacuation time. It is generally encouraged that public transportation modes, and if safely can be done, walking should be used to evacuate, and that we discourage people from using their private vehicles. Now, in order to achieve this, we need to bring in a policy involving the use of public transportation in the event of a natural disaster and figure out how to strategically carry out such an activity. Also, talking about the travel behavior and travel demand models, we need to have a look at the behavior of evacuees during and directly after a disaster. This knowledge gives us better understanding of evacuee behavior, and we need to chiefly look at models that take into consideration those vulnerable populations, that being the elderly, the disabled, and those captive public transportation users. These types of models will assist in developing policies for emerging evacuation plans, as well as guiding discussions in preparation for such events and to streamline processes pre, during, and post natural disasters. And the final step I'm going to talk about today is looking at a framework that will lead to a guidebook to assist the different islands in the Caribbean to create their own strategic transportation disaster management plans. Yes, every country is unique. However, a general guidebook could be used in designing a custom plan for each of those unique countries. So in conclusion, we know that disasters negatively impact how the transportation system provides safe, reliable, and sustainable mobility for the population. And we know that transportation greatly impacts the quality of life and the economy, even during a disaster, especially to those vulnerable populations. Incorporating transportation into disaster management could decrease the loss of lives and people's livelihood. And even though I have only mentioned road transportation in this presentation, this can be and should be expanded to air transportation and maritime. Nonetheless, countries in the Caribbean do not investigate the extent of how much transportation disaster research can improve existing emergency plans and would accelerate the recovery process. Future research and application of these recommendations could assist in advancing the current disaster plans. And thank you for that presentation.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wright. It is an interesting, and when I looked at the attendees, I see that we have persons from some very key organizations. The Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management is logged in, and I also see colleagues from the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force. And I know these agencies tend to be involved in the movement of persons. During times of a disaster, they tend to liaise initially with the regional disaster agencies, but also at the national level, depending on the extent. So I think it is very fortuitous that you made this presentation, essentially calling for an efficient transportation system to be included, to be infused, to be mainstreamed in national disaster risk management plans. And I think that is an important call, particularly when we see that many of our roadways and courses are impassable during times of a disaster, and they can lead to loss of life. So I think it's important for us to actually have a proactive approach to how we deal with transportation issues. So I thank you very much for that presentation, and I look forward to the conversation during the discussion. Our second presenter is Dr. Don Charles, who will look at the issue of disaster insurance to address damage and loss from climate change in the Caribbean. And by way of introduction, Don Charles is a graduate of the Department of Economics. He earned his BSc and MSc and PhD from our department. And he has 20 years of experience in the field, and it covers economic research, lecturing, project management, procurement, industrial relations, and administration. He has worked in the public sector and in academia, and also in organizations under the umbrella of the United Nations. He is, as at this time, he has 50 peer-reviewed publications, and his research interests are in energy economics, econometrics, international trade, value chains, climate change policy, and portfolio finance. But today, He's going to highlight his work on the area of climate change policy. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Charles to make his presentation to us this afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome, Don. You're on mute, Don.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank Dr. Atz for her warm introduction. I would also like to thank the Department of Economics for the opportunity to present here today, this afternoon. So let me share the screen to my PowerPoint. Is everyone seeing the screen? Okay, as you all can see from my presentation, the title of my presentation is Disaster.
Just put on, Don, just put on the slideshow so we'll have a better view and we can take it all in.
Okay, I think it's F5. Yeah. So as you all can see from the title of my presentation is Disaster Insurance to Address Damage and Loss from Climate Change in the Caribbean. So as you can see from the title, this is about climate change. Now, I know Dr. Atz is a very strong expert in this area, so I'm not pretending to be as strong or competent as her in this field. Nevertheless, my presentation is about climate change. So when I look at climate change, what is climate change? Well, climate change is, as our official definition, is a change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns. So for some countries in the world, how this climate change is going to manifest is by changing rainfall. So it might have a decrease in rainfall, it will have an increase in likelihood and tendency to experience drought. For some countries in the world, climate change will manifest in the form of increased extreme weather conditions, extreme weather events. So you have an increase in tropical cyclones, storms, and hurricanes. In the Caribbean region, well, the Caribbean region is one such region in which climate change is manifesting by the increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. Now, there are strong evidences to suggest that the Caribbean region is experiencing climate change. This is just two possible areas, two possible examples. So we look at the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. It marked the 6th consecutive above average hurricane season. And if you look at, let's say, over the 2015 to 2019 period, over those years, there was at least one Category 5 hurricane in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean region is experiencing climate change. What does this mean for the average country? Well, usually when these extreme weather events occur, there's usually damage to public infrastructure, private infrastructure, and in some cases, there's loss of life, loss of human life. Now, usually when these things occur, usually the government is left with the responsibility to cover the cost of relief and recovery effort, as well as to repair and restore all damaged public infrastructure. Climate change carries a cost. Extreme weather events carry a cost. No, climate change and extreme weather events is not the same thing. I want to establish that. It's just one of the ways it can manifest. So extreme weather events carry a cost. And we could see here in the Caribbean region in the year 2020, it caused approximately US 225 million in damages to the region. In 2021, Hurricane Elsa caused approximately US 50 million in damages to the region. So when these extreme weather events occur and they devastate public infrastructure, usually the government is left with the responsibility to restore the damaged infrastructure. And how do governments finances? Usually the governments don't have the sufficient public finance to finance this out of pocket. So what they do, they typically resort to debt financing to cover the total cost of relief and recovery effort, as well as the cost of restoring all damaged public infrastructure. Now, this raises a serious question. The Caribbean region are small island developing states, and they are very small absolute emitters of greenhouse gases, which is the cause of climate change problem. But the Caribbean region generally did not really cause the climate change problem. In fact, it was the industrialized countries or the former Annex I countries are the contributors to the climate change problem. However, if you look at the climate science, so that's the geography, the meteorology, the climatology, and so forth, the climate science can't link any country's greenhouse gas emissions to any extreme weather event. So no country, no industrialized country want to be held legally liable for climate change or any extreme weather event occurring in any country. So we have a problem. We have a problem where we have climate change occurring. The Caribbean, as small islands, developing states, are being disproportionately affected by climate change. There's an urgent need for finance, but the countries that are significant contributors to the problem do not want to be held legally liable for any extreme weather event occurring in any country. So what can we do? There's a need for a solution. What can we do? What mechanism can we use to mobilize finance to address damage and loss for climate change? Well, the mechanism that I was proposing to address this problem was insurance, weather insurance. So the objective of this study was to explore the mechanisms of a parametric insurance framework to mobilize finance to address damage and loss from climate change. Now, when I say damage and loss from climate change, I refer to the loss and damage that goes beyond adaptation and goes beyond mitigation. So this is extra damage and extra, there's additional funding and money is required to cover the cost of extra damage that will typically be beyond what will be covered by adaptation finance and mitigation finance. Now, in terms of insurance, what is the insurance? Well, many people are familiar with insurance. Insurance is a financial mechanism that allows one party that is risk averse to some event to be able to transfer the risk of the potential loss to another party willing to accept that risk. So the risk averse economic agent is referred to as the policyholder. They pay a fee called a premium, and the economic agent willing to accept the risk is called the insurer. Now, the insurance that I was proposing was a weather insurance. Basically, this is what weather insurance is not really the typical average insurance for the average person. This is insurance that usually cover like extreme weather events, so like you have excess rainfall, excess wind, or some unforeseen named peril. Usually, weather insurance cover these different things. So the insurance I was proposing was supposed to be structured along the principle of solidarity. Now, solidarity might sound like a very technical word, but what this really means is that we create an insurance and structuring a pool. We'll have both low-risk countries in the pool and high-risk countries in the pool. And we want to have policyholders enter the pool and they're paying a premium, but the premium that they're paying, well, remember I was saying premium is the fee that each policyholder will pay. The premium that each country will pay will not be proportional to the risk that will be bringing as they'll be joining the pool. Now, this is important. Now, I want to establish the risk. The risk in this context is the risk or the probability or the likelihood of the extreme weather event occurring in a particular country. This is important. Why? Because the Caribbean, I was strongly advocating for this, because the Caribbean region a series of high-risk countries, because there's a very high likelihood that an extreme weather event could occur in any country in any given year. So it's a very high likelihood that these countries will be filing claims. However, I was proposing this mechanism because you will have high-risk countries and you have low-risk countries. Effectively, what I was proposing is that you have a pool of both high-risk and low-risk countries. So effectively, the low-risk countries will be subsidizing the high-risk countries. The risk will be spread among a wide range of countries in the pool. And when this happens, unintentionally unintentionally or indirectly, the countries that are the highest contributors to the climate change problem by their greenhouse gas emissions will be effectively being forced to internalize the negative externality of their greenhouse gas emissions as to be subsidizing the countries, all countries or the high-risk countries in the insurance pool. So I'm moving on to the structure of the insurance framework. So in the interest of time, I'm trying to just skip ahead and move ahead to the actual essence of the presentation. So you have different levels of insurance. You have a macro insurance, you have a meso insurance, and you have a micro insurance. So when you look at a macro insurance, in a macro insurance, the policyholder is typically a government. So the government pays a premium, and when the extreme weather event occurs, they could file a claim and they could receive some kind of payout to cover the loss and damage they incurred after the occurrence of the extreme weather event. So you have macro insurance, we could also have meso insurance. In meso insurance, the policyholder is a special stakeholder group. So take for instance, we have in the Caribbean, there's an insurance called wind crop. this offers weather insurance to banana farmers in the Eastern Caribbean. How it works is that in the aftermath of an extreme weather event, so a hurricane, a storm, whatnot, these countries, or well, the stakeholders could file a claim with Windcrop, and it could receive a payout to cover their loss and damage that they experience in the aftermath of the extreme weather event. We also have another insurance in the Caribbean called micro. It is a micro insurance. So it's a micro insurance, which is insurance for individuals. And the name of the insurance is structured after the type of insurance it is. So the micro is an insurance that was created for Haiti in the aftermath of the hurricane that occurred in the year 2010. It was so the micro insurance was actually created in the year 2011, and this insurance pays out, makes payouts to individuals in Haiti after experiencing certain named perils. Well, the named perils in this context would be earthquakes, it's going to be excess rain, and going to be excess wind. So I just gave some examples of insurance, but the ideal insurance should be structured as a parametric insurance. Now, parametric might sound like a very technical term. What parametric really means is that the payout will be based on the occurrence of a named peril or a specific event. So in the specific event or the named peril could be excess wind, could be excess rainfall, and this is necessary. So because when you have insurance and the payouts based on the occurrence of the extreme weather event, it facilitates easy, quick payments with little ambiguity. In contrast, we could also have an insurance called indemnity insurance. In indemnity insurance, the policyholder files a claim in relation to the losses that actually occur after the extreme weather event. Now, this could work. However, if you look at the experience of this insurance in Caribbean called Windcrop, Windcrop works to some extent. It facilitates payout to the different banana farmers. However, in the aftermath of the different hurricanes and extreme weather event, we often see a large number of stakeholders being affected at the same point in time. So this becomes very challenging for on-site assessors to actually go and validate and verify the losses actually experienced by farmers. So this results in the Windcrop being slow, inefficient, and not working as optimally and as efficiently as it should be working. We also have another example of our insurance, our weather insurance in Caribbean called the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CCRIF. Now, this insurance is excellent. It facilitates the payout of claims to different governments. So it's a parametric insurance, and it is a macro insurance. The government is the policyholder, and it facilitates the payouts of claims to governments after the occurrence of named perils. While this works, the problem, well, I wouldn't say the problem, the limitation is that the money that is released when the different policyholders file a claim is just only sufficient to cover relief and recovery effort. However, what I was proposing is a weather insurance to cover the total cost of loss and damage from climate change. So in other words, what I'm recommending is an insurance framework to mobilize a larger payout to each policyholder in the aftermath of an extreme weather event. So in other words, they require a bigger payout than what we'll be getting under the CCRF.
Don,
pardon?
I know it's a lot that we want to talk about, but given that time is of the essence and we want to get in the additional presentations and also to have some time for the conversation. I mean, you're raising some very interesting issues, and I'm glad that you've pointed to the CRIF because I wanted to kind of ask you my own questions. Of course, you got me very excited when you started talking about the insurance issues, but I want to ask if we can pause here in terms of your presentation to allow for some more time for the other presenters, and if we can come back in the discussion period to explore further these issues. Just by way of recap, you made the point correctly about the active hurricane seasons that we've been experiencing, which could be attributed and could be manifestations of climate change actually impacting the region. One of the things with climate change is that we tend to talk in the climate change literature about slow onset disasters. So it's not as if we can actually identify what is going to impact on us and at which point in time. And you correctly also made the point about government being the primary actor in terms of bearing the cost of climate change and essentially using that as a platform on which you were building the case for this parametric insurance, and the fact that given the current debt profile of many of the Caribbean countries, what we really will be doing is trying to even put ourselves into a deeper debt situation if governments were asked to borrow to finance this. Just for the interest of our participants, the CCRIF, which was formerly known as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, interestingly enough, it made a payout to Trinidad and Tobago fairly recently following some of our heavy rainfall. So I want to put you on notice, Don, that I want to come back to explore a bit more about your financing proposal to cover damage from climate change and to explore that in terms of what would be different in terms of what you're proposing as opposed to what the CRIF currently does in the region, because I think that makes for a very interesting conversation given where we are positioned in the region, facing all of these additional threats and facing the cost of having to manage all of these threats in the context of sustainable development. So I want to put you on notice that that is going to be one of the first questions I think I want to pose myself in terms of how do we think through and navigate this uncertain space as we move forward. But thanks again for that very interesting presentation, and I'm going to come back to you shortly. It is my pleasure now
No problem.
to turn to our next panelist, who is a sister from in the Caribbean. She's from Jamaica, Michael Ann Urquhart. She's a Senior Director of Research and Measurement at the Jamaica Productivity Center. In this capacity, she undertakes policy-oriented and problem-solving research related to various dimensions of productivity. Her research and publications also focus on development economics, labor market dynamics, and the impact of human capital attainment. She's a trained economist with degrees from the UWI and Binghamton University, and her experience includes lecturing in economics and statistics, leading key research in various aspects of the Caribbean economy, and working as a public sector economist. She is a doctoral candidate in the economics department at the UWI Mona campus. It is my pleasure to invite Michael Ann Urquhart now to share her presentation with us on the topic of adaptation through climate financing, a case study of St. Lucian households. A tongue twister there. Over to you, Michael Ann.
All right.
And you are up, yes, you're up and live.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me first say thank you to the organizers of the conference for allowing me this opportunity to share my work. So today I will be presenting on the adaptation through climate financing, looking at St. Lucian households. This study seeks to understand what are the factors that influence or will determine whether households will be willing to take on climate financing in order to prepare against risk or to recover after they've experienced a disaster. Now, the main purpose of this study is to answer two questions. The first question that will be asked is, what is the value of a climate adaptation loan that will be demanded by households, and what factors influence the household's interest in borrowing to reduce climate disaster risk? Now, just to give you a snapshot of what we find and what we do, first off, just in case I run out of time, in terms of the study, I don't think I have to convince this crowd that climate change is very important and climate disasters are very relevant to the Caribbean context. So we know that St. Lucia is a small island developing state, very prone to hurricanes. And as climate change evolves and changes, we anticipate that we will have more frequent occurrences of hurricanes in the region. We are looking at a study that was done to collect, or data that was done to collect information from over 1,300 St. Lucian households. And what we observe is that over half of the households indicated that they would actually take out a loan, a climate finance loan, if it were in fact available to them. Now, in order to answer the questions, one of the things we do is that we actually look at ProWIP models, and we look at several dependent variables that can help us to determine the interest in climate adaptation financing. So the first, we look at persons who indicate that they want to actually have finance if it's available. We look at persons who indicated that they might want to have insurance or to increase their insurance coverage in the case of disaster. And for those who indicated that they think that even if they don't want it, that generally climate adaptation financing is going to be important to be offered by lending institutions. And then we look at the different factors across we can group them in 3 different areas. The first area being disaster impact on the household. So just whether or not a household would have been impacted by any disaster at all, whether physically or in some other way. And we look at persons' future expectations, how prepared they are. And then we also look at their financial experience, so how they integrate with the financial markets or institutions. So our main findings indicate that some of the factors that will increase the likelihood that persons will want climate adaptation financing include loss of assets, becoming more indebted after experiencing a disaster. If they felt that after having already experienced a disaster, that their physical safety was going to be affected. If they found that just generally having experienced a hurricane in the past 5 years of when the study was undertaken, and whether or not they found that their house needs to be improved to be fit in the event of another disaster. And I mentioned before that, the first question would be to try and assess the demand. The respondents were actually asked to indicate what was the minimum amount of climate adaptation financing they would want. And of all the persons that responded, we found that on average, they would have indicated that 24,000 EC dollars, which is about 9,000 EC dollars, is the minimum amount that they want, and that the average amount that they'd be willing to pay back in order to service a loan would be 140 US dollars. Now, in terms of looking at the importance of such a study, we recognize that there is more interest in generally in climate adaptation financing, but also more interest in terms of that financing being integrated into not just public spaces, but private spaces. And what we find is that looking across different countries, that there's different experiences or different factors that would lead to persons or countries wanting to take on climate adaptation financing in order to mitigate their risk, or again, in order to make themselves, in order to help themselves to recover. So for example, a study in South Africa would have found that high poverty levels, high population rate, and corruption would have been factors that would have impacted at the country level. At the household level in Austria, for example, we see that social norms, competencies are going to determine flood mitigation behavior. Now, these studies are quite interesting and they can give us some information, but we realize that since it varies across country, we want to know what does it look like in the Caribbean sense, right? Not only in the Caribbean sense, these other studies tended more to look at issues of flooding, but we have other issues in the Caribbean that we'd want to deal with. And so this study, I think, is timely and important for that reason. Looking at the case of St. Lucia, once again, and in the interest of time, I won't convince you that St. Lucia is vulnerable to hurricane risk, but it's a very costly thing and it affects a lot of households and individuals. And a lot of times when we see that generally in the Caribbean, when there are efforts to help persons or help the country recover, these are taken from a more macro level, but now we want to focus and look at what's the micro impact or how we can at least mitigate that micro impact. So when we look at the data, what we see is that the minimum amount of desired CFA, if it were available, would be between 500 and 500,000 Eastern Caribbean dollars. Again, remembering that the average would have been around 24,000. So that tells you that on average, it tends towards the lower ends.
And then the servicing amounts per month, persons reveal that they would be willing to pay anywhere from 20 EC dollars to 8,200 EC dollars. And if we were to look at the average that each person said that they would pay, or if we looked at the amount each person said they would pay each month, and we take that on average, how long it would take them to service a loan, it would be about 223 months on average. So persons are really looking for a long-term loans. At least that's what their revealed answers suggest. So this just shows you the distribution of the responses. I won't spend too much time there. And again, once we look, just to kind of give more information about the different types of, or the amount of money that persons are requesting or are looking for loans and how much they're willing to pay back. I grouped the responses in quintiles so that, you know, each quintile will have 20%. And so you can see there the mean amounts per each quintile. Once again, I indicated that I use a probit regression because we're looking at a binary dependent variable. So it's either yes or no, it has only two answers as to whether or not you would want climate financing if you're interested or you're not interested. And so for dependent variables, we were looking at whether persons want climate financing if it's available, if they would want more insurance, and if they think it is needed generally. In terms of looking at our household characteristics, which ultimately become our controls, we find that when persons are living in separate or detached households, have a wage income, that will increase their likelihood that are interested in CAF. In terms of looking at wanting the CAF or insurance, but it doesn't affect what they think generally. And then we find that other factors like having an older house where it's built before in the 1980s or having concrete walls will actually reduce the chances of you wanting to have CAF. And looking at other variables to try and explain what's happening, we look at hurricanes, we look at emotional impact in the household, the community level, the physical impact on the household, whether or not after having faced a disaster, the household was more indebted, faced asset loss, income loss, or threats to their financial well-being. And what we find is that hurricanes were the only actual disaster that registered any significant impact on wanting CAF. And then we also found that emotional damage, our emotional threats to emotional safety and physical safety of the household, increasing debt and asset loss are also important, increasing the likelihood of wanting CAF. Now, on the other hand, we looked at their experience with the financial institutions, whether it be informal or formal. And we found that, for example, having a credit union account, being a part of a SUSU, which is an informal arrangement, even having had attained formal credit in the past would be more likely to indicate that you would want finance in the future, which indicates that maybe your regular income is not enough to cover. We also looked at future expectations, and we see that households that want to prepare for future events are more likely to want CAF or think that it should apply. And in looking at our policy implications, we see clearly that more than 50% of the households are interested in climate adaptation financing. We need for climate adaptation financing to be inclusive because we recognize that persons who would normally be integrated in informal institutions would be interested in obtaining finance. And we need to realize that there is a special need for finance that is dealing specifically with mitigating risk, not only with the recovery process. And we also need to realize that it is important to see that persons are willing to take on risks that are over a long period of time. So those are careful considerations for both the private sector as well as the public sector. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for that very interesting presentation, Michael. I think, you know, several things jumped out at me. One, there is this thing this methodology that we have in environmental economics where we talk about contingent valuation, the willingness to pay based on how you view a particular good or service, environmental good or service. And, you know, that's one of the things that jumped out at me in terms of your research. But there is also, I think, the importance of us understanding the national landscape. So the surveys of living conditions tend to give you a sense of what people's domestic living circumstances are, as well as their income levels, their mean and median income levels. And I think as part of national policy, if something like this were to become national policy, I think it would be useful to layer research such as what you've done onto surveys of living conditions, so that you can get a sense of what might be an acceptable level of payment, climate adaptation financing that people might be willing to contribute, and you can build out an insurance system on the basis of that. So I just wanted to put that out there for our audience, that what we're really doing, what Michael has presented dovetails nicely with what Don presented in terms of the insurance and the financing aspect. I mean, he's looking at it from a macro perspective, and essentially Michael is looking at it from a micro perspective. But at the end of the day, they all impact on the national coffers. So if you don't have adaptation financing at the micro level and you are impacted by a natural hazard, it means that they can have macroeconomic implications, which is where Don's research comes in terms of looking at how do you finance insurance at the macro level so that we can recover and rebuild post-disaster. Because it's not as if we're going to remove our vulnerabilities. We will continue to be vulnerable, but we're simply trying to find mechanisms, both ex ante before the disaster, and both before the hazard, and ex post after the passage of the particular natural hazard event, so that we can build that level of resilience into our economic spaces. So I want to thank our three presenters so far, Leah, Don, and Michael Ann, and looking forward to the conversations that will arise very shortly. So I now have the pleasure of introducing our final panelist for this session, Mr. Robert Stewart. Robert is going to present on low carbon economic transformation, a case for a Trinidad and Tobago green investment bank. So all the conversations around financing for climate change, financing for disaster risk management. Robert has a PhD in economic development policy from the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISIS. SALISIS is based at the St. Augustine campus. He has been the recipient of several academic scholarships, the Eric Williams Memorial Scholarship from UWI St. Augustine, a Canada CARICOM Leadership Scholarship Program. He participated in that at the University of New Brunswick, Canada, and the Erasmus Plus International. And he attended the University of Graz, don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, in Austria. His research interests are in the area of financial development, banking stability, and regulatory capital administration. More recently, his research interests have been engaged with climate finance, examining financial policies that can mobilize financial capital towards low carbon economic development. So we're seeing that there is a trend here where we want to talk not simply about climate change and our vulnerabilities, but how do we build resilience, and resilience from the perspective of the financial dimension. So without further ado, I invite Robert to make his presentation. And again, I invite our participants to please send your questions and type your questions into the Q&A, because we're looking forward to having a very lively discussion at the end of the presentations. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Atz, and good day to everybody. In this presentation, I will outline the idea of green investment banks. I'll define what they do and describe how a Trinidad and Tobago green investment bank could actually help to accelerate financing for low carbon economic activity. So the primary motivation for a green investment bank is a need to create climate financing pathways. And these pathways help to support emissions reductions, help to support renewable energy uptake, and in general, help to reduce some of the existing barriers or frictions to low carbon financing. So what is a green investment bank? In essence, a green investment bank is really just a streamlined development bank or a streamlined development financial institution that has a specific focus on crowding in private capital for low carbon investments. Now, their design and operations tend to vary a lot based on their domestic context. However, in going through the landscape on GIBs or green investment banks, there are some fundamental similarities that they tend to have, and I categorize them in 4 different groups. That's their governance structure, their capitalization method, the asset vehicles that they use, and also the metrics that they use to measure their performance. So typically their governance structure, they're typically established through some sort of government legislation, and then they're governed or operated by appointed and independent board of directors. Capitalization method typically comes from government funds, and in some cases reoriented or reappropriated climate funds. And their asset vehicles tend to vary a lot, but typically they focus on long-term financing-based instruments, whether it be long-term loans, debt capital, equity, and so on. And in terms of performance measurements, they are designed to fund low carbon pathways. So one of the most common performance metrics that you typically see is the amount of greenhouse gas that's reduced, or the amount of renewable energy capacity that's developed through their investments or financing. Also, because of their agenda to crowd in private finance, they typically also have what's called a private investment leverage ratio, which looks at the amount of private capital that's attracted for every dollar of green investment capital that is deployed. So some notable green investment banks have been around for about 10 years, and others have emerged during that time. There are several listed here. Some notable ones include the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Australia, others at the country level in New Zealand, the UK, Japan, and so on. And there are several at the state level in the US. Some notable ones are the Connecticut Green Bank and the New York Green Bank. Capitalization sources also vary for some of these existing green banks. Some GIBs have used existing green funds or climate funds. For example, the Connecticut Green Bank, they were capitalized via an existing climate fund. And then they also established a mandate that allowed them to raise financing through green bond issuances. The Green Finance Organization, which is Japan's green bank, was also capitalized using a portion of Japan's green fund as well. And one of the arguments that I make is that Trinidad and Tobago does have an existing green fund, and there are conversations that it's been underutilized. And I think that if that green fund is reoriented into a capitalization structure for Trinidad and Tobago Green Fund, then that green fund could actually accomplish a lot more. Now, some green banks have done well to crowding private finance, which reduces the reliance on public funds for climate financing purposes. On the extreme right of the table, we have the leverage ratios for some existing green banks, and some of them have done extremely well. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation, they've crowded in about $2.5 or a little over $2.5 of private finance for every dollar of their funds that they've deployed. Connecticut Green Bank have done even better with 7.8, and the Japanese Green Finance Organization even much more so. So what do green investment banks do? They aim to fill the existing climate financing gaps. So they try to attract private financing to green infrastructure, clean energy, low carbon technology type products. They can also complement existing carbon pricing policies. GIBs can source capital via carbon tax or ETS in countries that actually have those existing frameworks, and can actually be used as a very effective institutional tool for recycling carbon tax. And most importantly, they can be used to leverage institutional capacities that will further deliver deep level transformations that are needed to create kind of systematic solutions that we need to challenge climate change. Now, how do GIBs achieve their outcomes? They tend to use different asset vehicles or financing mechanisms to improve what's called the bankability of projects. That is, they make projects more viable for private investments. And three sort of generalized financial mechanisms are listed here. You have credit enhancements, which reduces financing risks. So this typically might come in the form of guarantees or loan loss reserves, which makes it makes the credit risk involved in a particular type of investment or financing facility less. So a private lender would be more likely to lend and lend at more favorable terms. There's also co-investment, which reduces the level of upfront capital that a private investor might have to allocate. And then there's also warehousing, which tries to scale smaller projects to make them more attractive to large-scale investors. Now, GIBs can further provide a lot of institutional capacity building in developing countries, providing policy support, providing financial market development and support for climate financing-based instruments, and also helping the country to build effective international partnerships with other climate financing organizations. So this is just a general framework of how Trinidad and Tobago GIB could be established. The organization would be established as a government legislative institution with an independent board of directors. And then again, I make the argument that in terms of capitalization, which for developing countries is usually one of the more difficult things to source for an institution like this, Trinidad and Tobago has a green fund, which is about 7.6 billion. That was as at September 2020. And again, there have been concerns that it's been underutilized over its lifetime so far. Only about 5% of that fund has been drawn down up to September 2020. So by appropriating the green fund and the green fund level as levy as capital for the Trinidad and Tobago Green Investment Bank, the green fund could be better utilized. And this Trinidad and Tobago Green Investment Bank could then serve as a sort of centralized institution focused on the most important aspects of Trinidad's climate transformation goals. This could include executing the existing NDCs for Trinidad, the nationally determined contributions, also developing necessary innovative financing instruments for low carbon financing, and then helping to establish international partnerships while leveraging funding and technical expertise from other institutions that operate in the climate financing space. And it would also help to stimulate and develop domestic market for green financing instruments or for green financing in general. So in a 10-minute presentation, this is just the snapshot of what a green investment bank is, how they operate, and how a Trinidad and Tobago Green Investment Bank could actually be used within the framework of Trinidad and Tobago's climate financing goals. And I can end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that presentation. I know time flies when you're having fun. And I see it's something, I get the sense it's something you're very keen on. A lot of questions flowing through my mind again. I kind of have one of those active minds. So as you were talking there are lots of things that I want to ask. I want, however, to begin by thanking our 4 presenters on behalf of the department and on behalf of all of those persons, the participants who have logged in this fine Friday afternoon, raining where I am. So it's a nice, cozy conversation to be having about climate change and climate change impacts on a Friday afternoon. So I want to thank Leah, I want to thank Don, Michelan, and of course, Robert, who was our last presenter in this segment. 3 of our presentations focused on the issue of financing. How do we finance ourselves out of climate change, both from the adaptation side in terms of Michelan's presentation on climate adaptation financing, but also Robert's presentation on essentially a green investment bank. And one of the things, while Robert's suggestion, his research proposal is about using the Green Fund levy in Trinidad and Tobago essentially as seed capital for his green investment bank. One of the questions that occurs to me, and of course, having it as part of the governance structure, having it run by the central government, I was wondering, and this is a question that I want you to stick a pin on because we'll come back to it. I was wondering whether or not this was not something that perhaps the private sector might be keen on exploring as part of their contribution to the whole climate change conversation, whether this is not something, as with all other investment banks, whether this is not something that might be better situated or located in the private sector for reasons of efficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to park that thought there in your mind, plant that seed, as it were, for a while in your mind. And the other thing that I wanted to ask in terms of the Green Investment Bank is whether or not you have a sense of if there is an appetite for that kind of institutional framework in the Caribbean, because remember and that's also the reason that I'm suggesting perhaps it's a private sector conversation, because our governments already are wary, W-E-A-R-Y, in terms of all of the other financial issues, because when, and as Don made the point, when a hazard impacts on us and it turns into a disaster, the brunt of that is borne by our central government. So I just want to park those thoughts there for a while, and I'm going to come back in terms of posing some of the questions that are in the chat. But I want to begin by asking a question to, where is Leah? Yes, there's a question that was in the chat to pose to Leah in particular, in terms of the transportation system. So I want to begin where we started, and there's a comment from the attendee that says it is critical that transportation be looked at from a systematic perspective when addressing comprehensive disaster management. And I think that's precisely the point that you were making in your presentation. So I want to give you an additional 90 seconds to kind of, I almost said 90 minutes there, 90 seconds, a minute and a half to essentially kind of respond to the comment made by the attendee, but also giving you a second bite of the cherry, as it were, to kind of, ramage you a little bit in terms of your research topic. Should be part of a comprehensive disaster management framework. So some additional thoughts separate and apart from what you would have presented.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Atts. He's quite right. I do think it should be part of a strategic plan. It's one of those things where I think many people tend to overlook how important transportation can be. I mean, we all saw that when COVID happened and many of us were unable to fly or even interact with our friends and families, how much of an impact it had on our transportation. And when you're talking about disasters and when we have situations where persons can't access certain roads to get to and from home or to and from resources, and the flood waters are so high that the private car can't even operate in it, or in certain cases, we have situations where we're now looking at bringing in hybrid cars or electric cars, and the way how those mechanisms are set up, this too cannot go through flood waters. So when I talk about—
And then you're operating in crisis mode, so you're really not thinking through these issues.
But you're likely to get stuck. But I think one of the important points that I would like people to take away from this is when I'm speaking about transportation and incorporating it into disaster management, I'm looking at it as more than just the private car. In fact, I would like us to stay away from the private car and look at more the public transportation system. Yes, in the Caribbean, we have a public transportation system that leaves a lot to be desired, but improving that system and in doing so, developing a well-strategic transportation plan around disasters, as well as thinking about routes to take in case of some kind of event happening, be it flooding or hurricane or whatever the case may be. All of those small little things play a part, as well as we're looking at air travel and sea travel. When COVID hit, the ports and getting access to important resources was a problem? How do we also take into consideration the event of something else happening where we are limited access? How do we deal with those kind of things? All of those are under the umbrella of transportation that we need to put more consideration into as we go forward and looking at climate change and sustainability.
Would you say that supply chain and logistics issues should really be part of that as well?
Yes, I do think so. It's an important part. I mean, it's not something that I was able to cover, and my predominant research is in road transportation. But in developing the project further, we are looking at supply chain and the part that it will play in this overall project.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Leah. And really, you're spot on. I mean, we see what can happen in times of disaster where either communities, persons, particularly vulnerable individuals, are cut off, and we're not really thinking through the transportation and the access issues associated with different parts of the country. And then there's the other side of it as well, where you see persons trying to put on their superwoman or superwoman cape and trying to transport themselves through precarious waters, and sometimes it's leading to outcomes that we don't necessarily anticipate in terms of death, as the case might be. Thanks again for that, Leah. A question posed or comment posed in the chat by an attendee. It's a very long comment, but it speaks to both Michelan's and Don's contributions on insurance, and I'm putting that there. I mean, Michelan wasn't particularly in insurance, but I wanted to kind of couch it in that. And I'm going to extract from the comment because it's fairly lengthy. The person is saying there was a decision 2 from CP19, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage associated with climate change impacts, focused on insurance as a means of recovery. But the person is making the point, and I'm not familiar with this, so I'm just putting it out there as a general comment. I don't know if either of you is familiar with the specifics. The person is making the comment that large gaps in coverage make insurance an imperfect solution for loss and damage, with studies suggesting poorer countries benefit less. And you know, the person is further making the point that contributions by developed countries to insurance schemes have been sporadic, meaning most of the costs are being borne by people in developing countries that can ill afford these kinds of costs. And St. Lucia indicated that these kinds of schemes may lead to a rise in cost beyond the capacity of the national budget. And if I were to try to condense all of that, it is really what we call in the environmental economics literature, the polluter pays principle. Don made that point that the polluters aren't the ones who are willing to bear the cost, but the real cost of climate change and of these disasters are borne by small island developing states and developing countries in general. So 2 questions there, one for Don and one for Michelan. Don, in terms of the question that I asked, and again, the 90 seconds, what would be the main difference between what you are advocating and the CRIF as we currently have it? Because CRIF is parametric insurance, so it's not based only on named weather systems, whether it's Hurricane Martin or Marlene or whatever the case might be, or Karen as the case might be, but really in terms of heavy rainfall or anything that we consider to be unusual. What would be the main difference between CRIF and your proposal? And to Michelan, based on the comment and based on your own research, do you really think that adaptation financing is something that our economies can afford? When I say our economies, our people can afford. I understand the cost benefit, the cost of not having some kind of insurance, some ex-ante protection, but do you really think it's something that can take off in our economies, or is there a need for greater public education on the cost of not having this kind of financing? So Don, question to you first, and then Michelan, if you can then chime in terms of the specific question that I posed to you.
All right, no problem. That's an excellent question, Dr. Atz. Now, from doing research, I realized that the CCRF is in operation and it's very similar to what I'm proposing. But if you look at the structure of the CCRF, there are 19 Caribbean countries in the CCRIF, as well as 3 Central American countries. What I'm proposing is that we have an insurance framework with more countries, so more than just 23 countries. Not only that too, the CCRF funds covers named perils. We have excess rainfall, we have excess wind, and the payout usually just sufficient to cover relief and recovery effort. What I'm proposing is an insurance that includes more countries. So we want both low-risk countries as well as high-risk countries. We want a larger payout, and we want larger payouts. So when a country files a claim, it will be sufficient to cover loss and damage, loss and damage goes beyond adaptation and beyond mitigation. So I mean, this is significantly more finance that is recovered. And I acknowledge the other person in the comment was saying that we have the WASA mechanism. It was developed some years ago. And I also want to emphasize, they also acknowledge the insurance framework. And I also want to emphasize that since COP15 in 2009, countries was actually pledging 100 billion per year in climate finance. But this is almost like pledge, but no commitment, because I mean, you have climate finance, but it's not really accessible. So right now, there's an urgent, and it's almost like an emergency. There's an urgent need to mobilize finance, especially for Caribbean, small and developing states, because what happens in reality, the Caribbean countries go to some development bank, IDB, a World Bank, or some other bank, they borrow, they get some kind of loan, or if not a loan, a green bond or a blue bond, and it pushing the debts into ridiculous levels. Some countries' debt to GDP ratios are about 100% GDP. So there's an urgent need for finance, and as proposing this insurance mechanism as one way to address the challenge that the Caribbean islands are currently facing.
Thanks for that, Don. And I want to make a plug. It's not just Caribbean, small and developing states. Yes, this is where we're planted and this is where we have to graze, but it's small and developing states all over the world. At COP26, the tourism minister for Tuvalu, I think it was, he did a very dramatic presentation before the world stage. He was standing in water and the water kept rising, essentially making the point that their islands will be covered by water because of sea level rise. And he says, if you're covered by water, will they still consider you an island? So it's not just small island developing states in the Caribbean, but all small island developing states where they're already starting to feel the impacts of erosion. So some parts of those countries and livelihoods, particularly where they depend on fishing, they are in fact experiencing, and Graham is laughing because yes, he says it's a good friend from Tuvalu. Yes, that was a very dramatic presentation. So I imagine they were he's probably going to try to up that now in terms of COP27. Mikalan, in terms of this insurance question and climate adaptation financing, do you think that we have the capacity to absorb that kind of proposal?
All right, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important question. And I know that in presenting, I made a point, or at least looked at one of the options of persons indicating that they would need finance by looking at whether or not they wanted more insurance, or if they didn't have insurance, if they would be willing to take on insurance. So just to clarify, based on the research, I'm not necessarily proposing that insurance should be made necessarily at the national level. And I recognize the challenge there. In fact, that question that asked persons if they would be interested in taking on climate adaptation financing, it was actually very specific to loans. So I think a part of this question is not only thinking about making the government or the public sector responsible for providing climate adaptation financing or finding the funds to do this, but rather looking to see how persons and households are willing to help themselves and considering how that would look like if you're looking at the long-term opportunity cost. So for instance, if a household indicates that they're willing to, that they need a loan now, and one more point before I get to that, is that it's also not, you would have realized that persons would have also changed their perspective on wanting climate adaptation financing, not only in respect to having experienced the damage, but also in respect to the possibility of preventing against damage in the future. So if you're looking at it from a mitigation perspective, if you can help persons to secure their roof, protects against flood before something happens, then you're actually, you give them the loan, they do that. And if you look at their long-term expenses, then it prevents them in the long term now having to find a lot of money or being strapped or facing other issues, not being able to get to work because they're, trying to get their house sorted. So they're able to do things in a more systematic way and to build their resilience. So in essentially, it's just a matter of not necessarily placing that burden on the government, but also saying, is there an option for it to be offered through financial institutions, even if it means that maybe the financial institutions get some support to offer low-cost loans, but they're getting the money back. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a grant.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thanks for that explanation. Just want to intervene here and provide some feedback based on what is on the chat. There is a comment that the ODPM, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, is at this time, that's in Trinidad and Tobago, I'm taking it, is at this time engaged with the insurance sector in Trinidad and Tobago to develop small-scale parametric insurance policies that will enable households and individuals to have access to funds in the event of a disaster. So that's right on track, Don, in terms of what you've been talking about. And I think I have heard in one of my other lives, I've heard that conversation taking place. And there was a question that was posed to Robert, and I know Robert already very efficiently responded to the question, but I want to put it out in public so that everyone can have the opportunity to know what the question was and what is your take on it. And you will have the same 90 seconds to just kind of elaborate on it. So the question that was posed specifically to Robert in terms of the green investment banks, will GIBs, green investment banks, be inclusive of addressing deforestation for economic purposes and to encourage the development of green spaces in urban areas? So over to you, Robert. I know you've already responded in the chat, but I just wanted you to kind of articulate it so that everyone can hear what your take is on the issue.
Sure. I mean, good question. They certainly can be used that way. Now, GIBs are typically fashioned within frameworks that satisfy their domestic needs. So depending on the sort of green financing pathways that are needed or desired, they'd be set up with mandates and outcomes to satisfy those outcomes. So this being an area that Trinidad has some focus on is certainly something that could be established as part of the GIB mandate. Now, what I will say is most GIBs try to operate on reduced grant extension. So one of the main sort of operation mandate is to try and get private capital into these low financing spaces. So they try to stay away from grants and allow central governments to address, I guess, areas where private financing would not go. So if there are grant mechanisms, then it's probably not spaces where they might necessarily be. However, if in Trinidad there's not a lot of financing mechanisms to address those sort of areas, then you could certainly have sub-funding schemes within a GIB. So you could have a funding scheme that's specific to crowded in private finance, and then you could have another funding scheme that might focus on smaller but more important grant-based financing.
Thanks for that response, Robert. I want to come back to Leah. There's a question to you, kind of tricky one. Should we return to the remote workplace as a viable option to the transit labor force, since we realize the indirect benefit of the restoration of the environment where the emission of gas is reduced significantly? What's your view on that? Now be careful, tricky questions being recorded. But no, I think it's a good question.
I understand where they're coming from in terms of returning to remote working. However, that still does not deal with the issue that we're currently having of a poor public transportation system and people still relying on their cars for every activity. I mean, you're going to be working from home for X period of time, but at some point in time, you're going to leave home, and when you leave home, you're still going to use your car. And as it stands right now, the public transportation system in many of the Caribbean islands are not reliable, and people tend to stay away from them. So I think the bigger issue is, even if there is a policy or law put in place about working remotely, we still need to work on the public transportation system. That still needs to be improved, especially if, as I'm proposing, that is the system that we're going to use in the event of some kind of disaster. As it stands right now, it can't be used. So we still need to put in work on that system. And then on a whole, public transportation is more green than more sustainable than using a private car, even if we're talking about electric cars.
Thanks for that response. A question to Robert. And then we're going to start to wrap up because we want to get into the next session. So to Robert, Trinidad and Tobago has a financial sector subcommittee that consists of public and private sector banking agencies, along with others in the sector. The committee is responsible for preparing the sector to respond to and recover from disasters or complex emergencies. Do you see this committee as an element in your green investment bank structure, placing some responsibility for private sector financing?
Sure. And I mean, in these type of spaces, certainly where climate financing is concerned, you do want to try and build strong coalitions. And so it'd be very good to have some sort of private partnership coalition between the government and the private sector, particularly the financial institutions, in how you could actually develop some sort of maybe quasi-public, quasi-private GIB, as opposed to putting the full capitalization burden on public funds. So yeah, that certainly would be a good idea.
Excellent, thank you. And the final question is again being posed to the dynamic duo of Don and Michael Ann. So the question is there an opportunity to determine the main capacities between governments and private sector in the region to develop accessing climate finance funding? Was there an opportunity to determine the main capacities or the appetite of governments and private sector in the region to access climate finance funding? So Michaelan, if we can start with you, and Don, you will end off the session. Same question posed to both of you from your different perspectives, given your research interests.
All right, so I think that that's definitely something that can be done. In the scope of the project that was analyzed, it was definitely taken from the perspective of the household only, in trying to understand what are, this forms, at least this proportion that was presented forms a portion of it, trying to understand what are the factors that would help persons to recover, and then what are the factors that would force them to want to take on finance. So I think we're looking at it more in terms of the capabilities of the household to take on that type of financing. But I do see where it is possible to make those linkages through, for example, the survey of living conditions and other data sets.
Thanks. And Don, you have the penultimate word. I'll have the final word, but you have the penultimate word.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I was slightly go off track in terms of my original presentation. So a few years ago, I was
90 seconds.
A few years ago, I was working with ECLAC and was doing work in terms of climate finance, was looking at debt for climate swap. We saw that a lot of regions, a lot of Caribbean countries were very interested in a debt for climate swap, in the sense of just looking at a way to mobilize finance to address different challenges, not just loss adaptation, climate change, but to address a different challenges related to climate projects. I was looking at that debt for climate swap as a mechanism to more or less free us these different countries' fiscal space. I could say from certainty, a lot of different Caribbean governments are looking at any option that is feasible and is available to mobilize finance. So, I mean, looking at bonds and green bonds, blue bonds, but I don't really support bonds because these are essentially debt instruments. I want free finance. So I'm looking at different avenues that can mobilize finance to actually give you the money you actually need to address the problem that the different governments are facing. So I think this is what the governments are really open. Anything that's available that could mobilize funds, that can help them address the challenges that they're facing, they'll definitely be interested in them.
All right, thanks for that. And thanks again. A virtual round of applause to the panel. I think this was a very interesting conversation around not moving a little bit away from the issues of the impacts in terms of the physical impacts of climate change and disasters in our economies, and moving more into the financial sphere where it really hits. I mean, it really hurts in terms of the finances, and how do we reimagine and rethink how we treat with these issues as we try to grapple with climate change, not simply in terms of the physical impacts, but also in terms of the dollars and cents, so to speak. So I want to again thank my panelists, Leah, Don, Michaelan, and of course, Robert, for their very interesting presentations. And again, thanks to the department for hosting this particular session. So I close this session and I send you back to the chair, Dr. Henry Bailey, so that he will continue the rest of the evenings. Thanks again to the panel.
Thank you, Marlene, and thank you to your excellent panel. And we move from one very famous celebrity to another. Mr. Gregory Maguire is a principal consultant at VSL Consultants Limited. He's on a number of regional and local institutions. Currently, he's in the chair of the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and a board member of the governors of the Caribbean Climate Change Center, director of TOSL Engineering. He's been involved. I've seen Mr. Maguire many times at COTE over the years. So welcome and thank you so much, Mr. Maguire, for agreeing to chair the final session where we're gonna hear or have a discussion on the key takeaways from the various panels that we've had over the 2 days. So I hand you over now to Mr. Maguire.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bailey, and pleasant good afternoon to all participants online. It's always a pleasure to be at COTE. I've been here from the very beginning, and it's nice to see the conference continues annually and hopefully grows from year to year. Certainly, you will have had some high quality presentations today. I myself didn't get an opportunity to be here all throughout, but I did hear a bit of what took place in the last panel. So my understanding is that my brief today is to chair this session, which would include some of the panel chairs here. And I'm giving the names of 3 of my former colleagues, and I'm very happy to have such persons of such intellect and capacity here with us today. Regan Dionarine, Dr. Regan Dionarine, Dr. Marlene Atz, who just completed the last session, and Ms. Malini Maharaj. And what we would do is take a look at the key takeaways from the panel chairs, from the various 3 panel chairs. I think that these, in the interest of time, I think that most of these people have been introduced to you if they were panel chairs earlier on. I don't think there's need for me to read out these bios that have been given. Indeed, these people have some lengthy bios here. It may take us the rest of the afternoon. So with your kind permission, could I assume that you have heard these bios and you know them very well from their work, and there's no need for us to go through that. So all 3 are associated with the Department of Economics is what I would simply add as a general comment. So here we are at this conference of the economy and focusing heavily on the whole issue of climate change and climate finance and issues around that. And I don't know if we noted it during the course of today, but just in case you didn't, Hurricane, what's her name? Is it Iris? What's the name?
Lisa.
Lisa, is it? Yeah, I know it was a lady. Hurricane Lisa really had her attack hit Belize last night. And I know I'm sitting here in the stead of the Climate Change Center and kind of representing the Climate Change Center. So I thought it was interesting because I don't know if in fact they had agreed to be here, that they would have been here because of the attack on Hurricane Lisa last night. But all is safe from what I hear from the institution, although there has been severe damage in the country itself. So another timely reminder for us all about the ravages of climate change and what we need to learn to come to expect, and why we must protect ourselves against this and build resilience. So without much further ado, I want to move into the panel, and the way we will do this is that I think we will have the panelists summarize for them maybe the key takeaways, and then we would sort of encourage a greater interaction between them on some of the key issues that may emerge. So I could toss a coin, or I could go in alphabetical order, or I could toss a coin, or so why don't we go in alphabetical order? And in that case, all those with a name beginning with A should know that they would start up the process. Yes, I think that is fair.
I didn't think it was fair, but I mean, I won't protest because I just finished talk. I thought you'd have gone with Reagan, but never mind. I will rise to the occasion. I will rise to the occasion.
Very well.
I want to share my screen because I just have a few points that I've documented that I want to put up for conversation. So again, thanking my department, our department for hosting this timely conversation on climate change. I mean, Hurricane Lisa notwithstanding, I think it's important for us to grapple with this, and it's a conversation we've been having for some time. I just want to contextualize, particularly for those in attendance who are not from the department, what has been happening. So today, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, released their blog in advance. They do this regular blog that they send out. They released their blog today talking about the upcoming COP27. And before COVID, there was a commitment to net zero emissions because we want to get close to net zero because we want to minimize the amount of global warming that is taking place in the world that is leading to all of these catastrophic impacts in terms of sea level rise and hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera. So the IMF in their blog that was issued a couple hours ago today says getting back to net zero requires action on three fronts: steadfast policies to reach net zero by 2050, strong measures to adapt to the global warming that is already locked in. There's some things that we can't change, and staunch financial support to help vulnerable countries pay for these efforts. And it is interesting that the IMF said that, particularly what was discussed at the last session, looking at the issue of climate financing in various forms. The reality in Trinidad and Tobago, and these two statements under Trinidad and Tobago's reality are taken from an engagement that the Minister of Planning and Development had recently in preparation for Trinidad and Tobago's participation in COP27. She said that Trinidad and Tobago is considered a country that is among the world's most vulnerable to severe climate change impacts. And it's a point I made about other smaller and developing states. And of particular concern will be the role of just transition in implementing decisions, mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, and loss and damage. So the conversation we had in the last session in particular is spot on and aligned to what the government has been saying. Minister Beckles spoke about the government's initiatives in terms of electric vehicles, as well as target goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. Again, Leah's presentation on a comprehensive disaster risk management strategy that looks at the transportation sector, but in incorporating transportation as a conversation in comprehensive disaster risk management, it will also reduce the emissions from the transportation sector. And Minister Beckles highlighted the government's targets for reducing emissions consistent with the government's Vision 2030 National Development Strategy. Now, my thoughts that emerged from this conversation, and as someone who has studied the climate change scenario, I think I was one of the first people in Trinidad and Tobago to ever do certainly a PhD on the issue of climate change. I think so. I think I still hold that. I can't remember. But certainly, I think there are 4 points I want to make. There is a need for public education. It came out in some of the presentations. Presentation 3, the section on presentation 3, that need for public education. And I want to add here a whole of government approach on how we work towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and on climate change and what they will mean for us as Trinbagonians. I think there is an inextricable link between the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change. I mean, certainly some of the SDGs actually speak to climate change issues. So there is an opportunity for us to have the learnings from one influence the other, but there really, I think, has to be a whole of government approach. This is not something I think for the Ministry of Planning alone. I think it is something that should be infused throughout several other ministries, and I can name them, but they can also be mainstreamed into our national budgeting and development planning frameworks. For example, and that's my second point there, the new HDC housing developments and the new hotel that we've heard about in the media that is being built at the airport, are these going to be built with or without solar panels? And I think there is an opportunity for us to breathe life into the national conversation on renewable energy. Here is an opportunity for us to actually put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and to actually use these new developments to showcase renewable energy solar panels. There are lessons coming out of Barbados. Many of us know that Barbados has had solar panels for as long since Rock of Ages was a pebble. Barbados has been using solar panels. So there is an opportunity for us with these new developments. And this is why I'm saying a whole of government approach. So if it's the Ministry of Works and Transport or whichever private sector investor operating at the airport, here is an opportunity for us to talk about renewable energy and to include renewable energy via solar panels into those new developments. And of course, the similar conversation and suggestion being made for the Ministry of Housing in terms of new housing developments. Have the new housing developments included with solar panels, because they will all contribute to the learnings in the national community, but also contribute to reducing Trinidad and Tobago's carbon footprint. The third point I wish to make is that I think there needs to be public education on climate change and what it means for us in terms of energy, the conversation around energy transition and the cost of that transition. We know it is not zero cost. It will come at a cost and some cost for the country and for the population. What climate change means for us in terms of tourism, our traditional tourism product is sun, sea, and sand, as opposed to other kinds of tourism products, including our growing festival product and our food. You know, we've been seeing blogs about international foodies traveling to Trinidad and Tobago to taste the cuisine and to showcase the cuisine. We need to start the conversations and the public education around what climate change means for these sectors, and of course, agriculture. Our traditional focus is on land-intensive agriculture, which we know is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. One presenter earlier spoke about the impact on fisheries in communities and the impact on the livelihoods. Here is an opportunity for us to talk about climate change adaptation in the agriculture sector by use of things like hydroponics, so less land-intensive agriculture as a way of creating adaptation and inculcating adaptation into the agriculture sector. And of course, the fourth point I want to make in this first round of the conversation is we need to tease out the costs and benefits on the road ahead for Trinidad and Tobago, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And this is a role for an institution such as the Department of Economics to help facilitate that kind of work, that kind of costing out what will be the cost, the direct and indirect cost, but also the benefits that can accrue to Trinidad and Tobago on this road ahead for us. It is not going to be an easy road. We're talking about energy transition from non-renewables into renewables. We're talking about changing the mindset in terms of how we do our business. But I think it is absolutely imperative for us in the coming days, months, years ahead. Some of these commitments that we've made require us to rise to the occasion by 2030, which is just around the corner. How do we tease out the costs and benefits that are implied in the road ahead for Trinidad and Tobago as we talk about climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation? So, Chair, those are my initial thoughts at this time, and I'll be happy to engage in the conversation as the evening progresses.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Atts. We now move on to the second panelist. Regan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Gregory. It's good to see you and to be here with you and the other who have been sharing some very important sessions. It is a pleasure as well to once again be here with the audience on the second day, and the level of participation via questions and people who are looking on right now. So really good stuff. In keeping with the continuing theme of this conference of the economy, the first session, which I chaired, dealt with a review of the economy, both Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean region. And I think there were a lot of good things that were said there, but let me itemize. Our first presenter in that session was Dr. Conrad, who, among the many points, what stood out was that we have recovery in terms of GDP growth in PNP now, and it is something that we welcome, and something that has been elusive for a few years because of the different constraints and global happenings. But the point was also made that while we have a recovery and we're early in that process, that a carbon-based environment, fossil fuels, that market is extremely volatile. So while we have high prices right now that's fueling the recovery, but we are in a volatile environment. And in addition to that volatility, we have these global uncertainties that are still playing out. So what does that mean? And this is really the takeaway from the Trinidad and Tobago perspective economy is that we have a finite number of time period, a short time period. We don't know how long, but we have these windfalls that are coming right now over that finite period. And while it is that we can think about spending and being able, as a country, to open back up spending again, but we need to be to think carefully and judiciously over the use of these windfalls. And in particular, what we need, the point that came out, or the suggestion that came out there, and an imperative, is that we need to focus that windfall into continuing and new investments, and that is really a future for our country. So it can't just be spending at the point, but we need to make those investments in infrastructure that might be deteriorating, or in infrastructure that we need to open up new industries. There's also a critical need for further investment in human capital. And while we have on many different dimensions a high level of development in terms of human capital, depending on the type of proxy that one looks at, but productivity issues, for instance, remain an issue. We need to do the thing that we need to address. A key consideration coming out of the question and answer segment there, surrounding Dr. Conrad's presentation, was the role of investment in green energy. And I know we've been speaking about that throughout the conference. But the point there is that while it is, we need to consider that investment in green energy is costly. It requires a huge upfront cost, but we will experience a payoff later. And so we need to think about that in the context of the windfall. If we are going to invest in green infrastructure, that's a costly endeavor, and we need to, while we have windfall and we have the capacity to do so, we need to think about that timing. We're not going to experience the benefits right away. There are going to be benefits, but the benefits that come from that arise from that will come a number of years later. But we need to think about when we make that transition and we make that type of investment. So that was Dr. Conrad's presentation. We went on, our second presenter was from the Central Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Ramanathan, and he highlighted his presentation revolved around the state of Caribbean economies. Tourism-based economies as well as commodity-based economies took a huge hit over the pandemic period. And while it is that those markets are somewhat rebounding, but GDP, and this is the point that he's making, that GDP hasn't rebounded commensurate with the rebound in those markets. Foreign exchange issues continue to challenge countries throughout the region, both in tourism-based economies as well as the commodity-based markets, and it curtails the environment for which policymakers can have some leeway in steering those economies forward. So we continue to face those foreign exchange problems. And the other headwinds that the region is facing, we all face certainly higher food prices and higher debt coming out of the pandemic period. So those are the the things that we need to grapple with. The takeaways, therefore, what does this mean? That we need to grow economies differently, that continued dependence on primary commodities and tourism, while it has been the bread and butter of our economies for a number of years, but we see that during upheavals or difficult times, that things go bad quickly, and our ability to recover, and therefore livelihood and the well-being of our people, there are limitations on what we can do. We need to grow economies differently. The suggestion that came out there is that we need to focus on digitalization infrastructure, both in the context of making existing resources more efficient, more efficient use of existing resources, as well as in the context of creating new opportunities and new industries. And then there was also the thrust in the presentation for the need to invest in renewable energy. In the region, many countries face high energy prices, and we've seen something of the volatility. And then on the other hand, we have climate change. So the need to invest in renewable energy is there. And I juxtapose that against the point from the previous presentation that those are up front, and we need to think carefully about when we make those investments, especially as the benefits may not arise right away. But so it requires some conscious planning. We had a presentation on market risk with respect to cryptocurrency market, and in that the presenter, Mr. Sad, the level of risk in cryptocurrency markets versus traditional stock markets in the region, established stock markets in the region, and the finding was that our markets are still safe forms of investment over the pandemic period and post the pandemic period than investing in the top 5 cryptocurrencies. Although among the top 5 cryptocurrencies, so we are a safer form of investment in traditional markets here. Among the cryptocurrencies, stablecoin represented less risk. Now it's still risky, but less risk compared to the other cryptocurrencies, and that has something to do with perhaps has something to do with the fact that that is tethered to the U.S. exchange rate. So Caribbean markets are still perhaps, while there's an attraction to cryptocurrencies, but Caribbean markets still represent a safer form of investment. And lastly, we had a very unique thing this year, a discussant in the form of Dr. Delana Lane, who was the Deputy Director of ECLAC, who provided some points, concerning how we move the region forward, among other points that he made. And two things that stood out from his points that he made, which is that we need more developed economies had a higher proportion in exports of services compared to the Caribbean region. And I'll say that again. The point he's making and underscoring here in terms of how we move forward, we find that more developed economies, services are bringing more revenue and therefore constitute a higher proportion of in those more developed countries as compared to the Caribbean region. And so we need to sell our services more, is a point here, particularly vis-a-vis bringing foreign exchange as well as monetary revenue and creating opportunities for ourselves. And when we talk about services, and this is a much larger and ongoing conversation, a simple, nothing simple about it, but Carnival, for instance, he asked the question, how can we sell our services? We are among the best in the world in Carnival, for instance. Why and what are the impediments in broaching Carnival bringing a greater share of export earnings than it might be doing so currently? Food for thought. The other point that he made, a major point that he made, was that we need to better align our approach to development to encourage the service sector, for instance. And he passionately spoke about one of the huge takeaways that I am certainly interested in and certainly endorse, is that the need for education reform and in light of promoting economic development. He raised the point that we have a one-size-fits-all type of approach to education in the region, and that type of approach might be spinning our development. How entrepreneurial is that approach when we endorse one type of education system for all, while we also acknowledge that there are better loaners and different loan types and things that people are interested in. So he spoke, we didn't have time to explore that point in more detail, but this is a very important point coming out of session one, the need to align ourselves for development. I'll end with it.
Thank you so very much, Reagan, for your input, summarizing what took place earlier on in session one on the review of the economy. We want to move on quickly to Malini Maharaj. Malini, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Maguire. If possible, can you just allow me to share my screen quickly?
You're on.
Thank you. All right, so I'm speaking to panel 3, which addressed issues on vulnerability and resilience under climate change and natural disasters. And
Nalini, you may want to switch to presentation mode because we're seeing your slides at the side.
Sure, no problem. All right, just excuse for a second. All right, so I'll work without it for the moment because it's really just a review of the dimensions of vulnerability and resilience addressed by panel 3, in particular addressing the issues of gender and capturing inequalities and the impacts of climate change and natural disasters. Then at the community level, looking at measurement and assessment of vulnerability, and then addressing the possibility of innovation where vulnerability can be seen as an opportunity for development. Now, the presentations from this panel fit in quite well under the thematic area of the Conference on the Economy in terms of, what does climate change and natural disaster imply for our economic development, for our sustainable development? And from a Caribbean perspective, it represents yet another challenge, given that in the Caribbean, the whole term vulnerability is part of our definition. And if nothing else, COVID-19 has reminded us that as a Caribbean region, we are vulnerable. So we have always known and felt the brunt of vulnerability in terms of natural disasters. This was epitomized in hurricanes, past and present, earthquakes, and even volcanic eruptions. And now we have to face climate change, which is exacerbating the frequency and intensity, particularly of weather-related events. And again, it's a reminder that no matter how big and bad our economies grow to be, and bad, I'm playing that word bad, we still are at the mercy of our environment. And we have been forced to accept the truth that without the environment, there will be no economy. So we have to deal with coastal erosion, for example, which has been claiming coastal lands and infrastructure. We have to deal with rise in sea levels and temperatures, and we're seeing our coastal regions inundated with sargassum seaweed. Our tourism industries are being affected by coral bleaching, and our tourism product itself for the majority of the Caribbean region is now being compromised. So for countries that depend heavily on tourism, this implies economic decline. It implies potential losses with the contraction of our tourism product, our sun, sea, and sand. So I think the presentations from yesterday and today would have established the fact that our region derives our bread and butter from the environment, whether it's tourism, whether it's agriculture, or even energy. It means that we are living off our nature, our environment, and therefore with too much rain, too little rain, too high temperatures, or even too low temperatures, we feel it. We look out our windows right now, and sometimes you get a skip in your heartbeat because you're not too sure what to anticipate we have somewhat of a bipolarity in our weather because you're not certain about what is going to happen from today to tomorrow, even from this hour to the next. So we have been bearing the impacts of climate change. We have felt the economic impacts in particular when we go to the market and, we complain about the price of produce, or how much we complain about, our electricity bills when we have to run air-conditioned units, when we have to worry about whether it's going to flood or not. And I think, again, persons who really experience this at the community level can speak to it. There is always an uneasiness when you see the change in the weather because you are threatened. It is a threat. You feel it because you don't know whether 5 minutes of rain is going to take 5 days of recovery. And we also feel it when we see our fellow citizens lose their homes, their livelihoods, or even their loved ones. So vulnerability is a reality. It's not just existent in the textbooks with a multitude of definitions. Vulnerability is a reality that we all live in, and it is, as I said, part of our definition. And I think what in particular panel 3 was able to highlight is that vulnerability can also equal opportunity. And it then creates the discussion forum for us to move forward in terms of how do we utilize our inherent characteristics? How do we utilize what might be indigenous to our communities, such as Orange Valley, to our region, in our traditional knowledge? How do we utilize this to help us create a more sustainable path towards development? I think it means appreciating our characteristics and seeing beyond what we just might consider a challenge in terms of our definitions of vulnerability. So in the presentations, in particular, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, how do we justify spending on climate change and natural disasters when sometimes it seems as if we have other more important priorities? And how, therefore, can innovations bridge the gaps between our economic and environmental needs? Not that there should be a distinction between the two. Our economic and environment are one of the same. We can't have one without the other. And how then should policy be crafted to address the multidimensional developmental needs, particularly that of equity and inequality, which was highlighted by one of our panelists? The main takeaways, therefore, I think, is that for us to recognize that vulnerability can be viewed as an opportunity. Building resilience can be also viewed as a regional public good, where one country's benefit does not compromise another country's ability to benefit. And similarly, when we look at it internally, helping individuals, particularly our most vulnerable individuals, build resilience is a social good, a public good. Furthermore, there is opportunity for innovations that are not just technological, because when we talk about innovations, we think technology. But there can be innovations in the development of institutions. There can be innovations in the development of our education system, and even in our economics, that again reflects our strength as a Caribbean region, building from the grassroots what we can learn and what we can develop as our own, not necessarily being imposed upon us, not necessarily being taught in the traditional textbook economics that we depend on, but creating that opportunity to build our own so that we become more resilient. So with that, Chair, I would like to hand it over back to you and welcome questions later on in the discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Malini. So we've heard from the chairs and already 2 questions already a few questions have begun to come in, which we would take very quickly. So a quick summary. I mean, you know, I think some of the things that stood out for me and what I've just heard, beginning with Dr. Atz, is the need for public education, the need for a whole government approach. I always say on my own end that the entire ecosystem must be engaged in the whole question of climate change and building climate change resilience. It's not a one sector thing at all. And importantly, how does climate change affect the various key sectors and how we respond to it, and the importance of cost-benefit analysis on the choices that we make, particularly choices we make of big projects, which is something that we've been saying about in the university now for decades, really. A question that arose from Regan's summary for me was, seems to me that we're in a kind of almost inherently conflicting situation as Trinidad and Tobago being a fossil fuel producer and continue to be dependent on that. At the same time, we have to do our part and play our role in terms of the building resilience to climate change and reducing carbon footprint. So that's a difficult policy position to be standing, and I'd like to hear some comments on that as well. Nalini, of course, emphasizing the question of vulnerability and building resilience and seeing both of them as possible opportunities for innovation and so on. So those are some of the things that stood out for me. I don't want to seize the floor, and I just want to go quickly to some of the comments that some of the questions that were being posed. And one came from Dr. King, and he specifically asked Dr. Atz, the comment he made was solar panels on new developments, particularly HTC. He fully agrees with the idea, loves the idea, but he says that it depends on the establishment of feed-in tariff, which has not yet been established. And Dr. Atz, you wanted to speak to that?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for that, Gregory, and thanks for the question, Graham. And I think it goes back very poignantly to the point I made about the whole of government approach. We have been talking about feed-in tariffs for a long time, if I remember correctly. This is a conversation that has been around for decades, but we've not advanced that to the point of implementation. But we're now having, at every budget presentation, there is a conversation around renewable energy and how we're going to, put incentives in place for renewable energy. And the point I was making about the HDC, the housing development, and Graham is correct, we don't have a feed-in tariff, so there is really there is a mismatch. And there are two opportunities here. One opportunity for us to breathe life in a very, specific way on the question of renewable energy. So apart from electric cars, etc., you have these housing developments and every home has a solar panel on it. So that is sending a very clear message about the seriousness in terms of reducing the carbon footprint and ensuring that the population transitions into renewable forms of energy. So every home with a solar panel, it's the kind of thing that you see when you're flying into Barbados. Every possible building has a solar panel on the rooftop. But the second part of it is that it will allow government and the whole of government to really be in alignment on the question of renewable energy. So whether it's the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Public Utilities, the Ministry of Planning, whichever ministry or ministries will be responsible for advancing the conversation on the feed-in tariff, there will also be that opportunity. So on the one hand, it will have the opportunity to have this housing development project and the new airport, the new hotel at the airport that I think I saw in the newspapers yesterday, have those buildings constructed with these solar panels and all of the fittings that really speak to reducing our carbon footprint and embracing renewable energy. But it will also require, for successful implementation of these projects, will require the feed-in tariff to be finally realized in Trinidad and Tobago. So all of the relevant departments that will be required to actually bring this thing to implementation, because I mean, I'm at that stage where I think I've heard this before, but I'm fairly certain we've had the conversation about feed-in tariffs in Trinidad and Tobago over decades. So this will be an opportunity for the whole of government to pool resources to actually allow us to realize this particular incentive mechanism that will speak to and will say that Trinidad and Tobago really is very serious about renewable energy. So I think it's an excellent point that Graham raised. Yes, I think the housing is important, but if we were actually able to get the feed-in tariff in place and implemented and operationalized, it will send a very strong signal about our seriousness about renewable energy in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's really an opportunity for a whole of government approach in terms of taking this forward.
Thank you so very much, Marlene. Reagan, both Reagan and Nalini, I think I want you all perhaps to address this possible policy conundrum that we're in, where certainly Trinidad and Guyana are big fossil users, fossil fuel producers, and the economies depend on them. And at the same time, they have to be in the conversation for climate change mitigation and reducing carbon footprint and so on. How do you all see us moving forward with development strategy in the context of this perhaps inherently conflicting, contradictory objectives?
I think, Dr. Dinanana, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, I think we need to learn from each other. Definitely, Guyana can look at the experience of Trinidad and Tobago and see what really should and should not be done. But in the context of climate change, as still relatively low global emitters, we are very energy intensive, and in terms of our consumption in particular for Trinidad and Tobago, our decisions have been primarily based on the fact that we have this resource endowment. And it has led to a lot of our unsustainable activities, which contribute, even if very small, to climate change, but it suggests that we have not been developing in a sustainable manner in any event. I think what we need to bear in mind is that with non-renewable resources in particular, we want to maximize what we can get out of them without necessarily, without degrading the environment, and ensuring that the benefits from these resources, these fossil fuels, benefit this generation as well as future generations. That, going back to that whole theme of sustainability. The challenge again is, how do we maximize the resources? Because from an economic perspective, there is the macroeconomic need for revenues from our resources, while at the same time operating within the requirements to be sustainable. I would like to just at least address the resource funds and how resource funds such as our Heritage and Stabilization Fund, supposedly two separate funds by now, are operationalized, and recommend that Guyana looks towards developing and also operationalizing a resource fund that would maximize what the resource offers in terms of revenues, but utilize those resource revenues in manners that will lead to sustainable development, and through that develop other sectors of the economy that will allow the country to diversify and therefore have contributions from sectors that will exist even after the demand for fossil fuel, or even after the resource itself is not viable. So in terms of maximizing what can be gained in the present, but reinvesting those gains is very important. And as I said, Trinidad and Tobago can be used as an example. In some ways what should be done, but also in some ways what should not be done. And therefore Guyana has that learning curve that they can rely on in terms of Trinidad's experience. Climate change wise, we need to really create the foundation for renewable energy to replace our dependence on fossil fuels. It's a cultural need as well, because we have a certain comfort that has been developed by the fuel subsidy. And I think that is a first step in integrating our decisions towards sustainable development and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you very much. Regan?
Yeah, Gregory, that's a good question. And there is a dichotomy there. You know, I did a paper published in Social and Economic Studies, I think it was back in 2018, where we looked at energy consumption and emissions in the region. And where your question comes in here, Trinidad factually is one of the highest emitters in the region. You know, so when we talk about climate change, we are a contributor in per capita terms. Per person. But I think the point that we made, which is that compared to quantity as a country, compared to other countries, we're small. And therefore that contribution to climate change and negative aspects of it are not as much. I think that the market is going to drive those decisions, you know, and this is where dichotomy comes in, you know, so we high emitter, but we also have one of the lowest cost of energy in the region as well, which is the reason why we consume so much energy from fossil fuels. And to come back, you know, I think the market is going to determine where we head, where prices, you know, remain or prices here remain low in terms of energy costs. Then we're going to use that, and as those costs rise, we will find two things happening: moving to more efficient technologies, as well as hopefully moving to renewable sources of energy. How do we drive that imperative? Investment. We need investment, and this is the other part of the conversation coming out from panel one, which is to utilize the windfalls that we have judiciously. Infrastructure, green development takes money, and you know, when we can accomplish that is by judiciously using the money that we have in a timely manner to make that conversion.
Thank you much, Regan. Marlene, you wanted to say something on the question?
Yeah, just a quick tack on, as it were, to Malini's point about, you know, encouraging us to learn from each other in the region, and particularly Guyana. I mean, Guyana was known to have to be carbon neutral until they started to experience the windfalls from oil, and we know what is likely to happen with that. And I wanted to juxtapose the windfalls from Guyana, infuse Malini's point about the caution about Guyana, kind of navigating the space carefully as they move forward and they enjoy this wealth. And just to put out there that 2 days ago, the World Bank says that poverty in Guyana is among the highest in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think, of course, all of this is just coincidental that headline came out and that we're having this conversation at this time, but it makes the point that even as you're enjoying the revenues and you're enjoying the windfalls now, unless they're used judiciously in a way that can lend to realizing sustainable development, you're simply going to find yourself widening the gap of inequalities in your country. I mean, this is coming not from, you know, they will say that whoever said this, if the university said it, they'll say the university has said the right thing, but this is the World Bank, highly respected, saying that Guyana has one of the highest levels of poverty in Latin America and the Caribbean, and something that I think is an additional alarm, even as they navigate their newfound wealth and deal with the issue of climate change, but also simultaneously deal with the issue of sustainable development, not dissimilar to the challenges that Trinidad and Tobago has to face. So I think it's an opportunity for us to learn from each other and ensure that we come out on the other end of this a little better off than we are now.
Okay, great. Just one last thing I want panelists to respond to. The three presentations somehow made the point about public education and the importance of the public education and the importance of educational reform and so on. Is there anybody care to venture some specifics on what would good look like in terms of any level of education for us? What to your mind does good look like? Given the challenges that you all see, what does good look like?
Gregory, a better state of the world for me would be where our citizens have opportunities for that at education commensurate with their interests and what they have capacity to go into. This is one modality where we think of education, continued education, and that one mode as academic attainment within certain types of subjects or core areas is good for some people. But I don't think, my personal view, that is necessarily something that is going to fit every individual in society. And so implicitly at a large level, we tell our people that unless you are good at this one type of thing, there may not be a place for you. I think a better state of the world is where we have a bit more variety to cater to different types of learning, different types of skills, and different types of interests.
Okay, Nalini?
One of the things I remember that developed my passion in economics was Professor Theodore's famous, quote from Sir Lewis, where he spoke about what good economics is. And he said, good economics is about understanding the conditions under which people live. And I relate that not just to economics right now, because I explain to my students right now that you can be the most educated, wealthiest, healthiest person by all measures of success, with the biggest house and everything you could possibly desire. And you walk out on the street one day and somebody takes a gun and pulls a trigger. It's worth nothing. It's not, it's worth nothing. And the point of that is that with everything, we have to recognize that we are part of society and we affect society as much as society affects us. So I think a good education system requires that we instill within our society, the members of society as individuals, the importance of behaving and acting with a consciousness of how they affect their fellow citizens, how they affect the people around them directly and indirectly, and how they are affected as well. And from the very primary level to tertiary level, I think if we develop this understanding that it is more than just passing courses, which is the current system that we have. It's really about livelihoods and passion for who you are and who the people around you are as well. I think our education reform really would be better by doing that, just from that philosophical point of view, and just developing that appreciation for the people around you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mara. Doctor, you started, so you bring it.
I've reflected on it, public education in the context of the conversation we've had over the last 2 days. And for me, my utopia would be that when we present national budgets, for example, that we really speak to a whole of government so that we can see as citizens how our limited resources are leveraging each other and working together to create the kinds of outcomes that we want in our country. So every time I hear budget, I must hear that we're working towards a common goal. So for me, public education in the context of what we've been discussing would really start at that level, and it will then permeate through the various tiers of our society, even down to our primary levels, our early childhood levels, so that every Trinbagonian, because the challenges that we have ahead are not for a government, it is for a country. And it's for all of us to be on that train moving forward to kind of help us reach the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030 and reach reducing our carbon footprints by 2050. This is not just a whole of government, a whole of Trinidad and Tobago. So for me, public education would really require that deep and wide understanding of where we are in terms of the fiscal issues, the monetary issues, but also the environmental issues, the climate change issues, sustainable development issues, so that we work together as an army of 1.4 million with a common understanding of what our specific roles and functions are to take us to that place, to take us to the promised land, so to speak.
Thank you so very much. On that note, I think I want to thank all three panelists for your outstanding contributions here this afternoon, and give everybody give them a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much, people. And let me turn back over to Dr. Bailey.
Okay, thank you for that. So thanks again, Mr. McGuire. That was a pretty awesome wrap up. I'm actually sorry that it's over. There's just so much stuff going around, so many ideas swirling around this issue, and it just kind of reminds us of the number and scope of things that are in some way connected with climate change, and the way that we are poised to deal with it, to deal with this. So the moment has come to bring COTE 2022 to a close. I must thank again the sponsors, FCB and NGC. And it's also, I want to recognize the presenters. I think the presenters were all awesome. All the presentations were world class. The session chairs were all actually exceptional, including the session chairs that had to step in at the last moment and take a session over, which they're not necessarily prepared for. The audience also, we had a pretty strong audience this time around, so it was really great of you guys to be part of the discussion and part of the questions that you submitted. Last but not least, I must recognize the outstanding committee that made this thing the success that it was. Joel, as a champion. This Joel should be deputized for life to be the commander of the COTE project. Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Conrad, Roger, Louise, Cedrina, Jennifer, everybody did really well to make this a success, to make this a great meeting. So thanks to everyone. And that's it. We're ready to close. Joel, am I missing anything?
Close.
Okay, cool. So we're ready to close. So, oh, hey, we have
before you close, Henry, I just want to say thanks to you. I know you were out of your comfort zone for a little bit as you took over chairing COTE. So I must say thank you very much. A job really well done. And like you, I know a lot of what happens in COTE really is because of Joel. So we really, I know he goes beyond the call, especially where COTE is concerned. I don't think anybody knows as much about COTE as he does, how to get it together, how to get it to work, how to make sure it looks as smooth as it does on the day of the presentation. So we really need to say a big thank you to him, a big thank you to you as chair, to Roger McLean as co-chair, to Darren, to Jennifer. So there were so many people that played a part. And then also like you, we say thank you to everyone who came forward, because I know very, very last minute I asked Marlene to help. And she, without even batting a lash, she said, bring it. And we brought it and she brought her side. So thank you for all of that. I will pass it back over to you, but I really just wanted to say a special thanks to you, because I know that you were in a place that you're not normally. So thank you very much for holding the fort for us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. So with that, we bid you farewell until COTE 2023. So
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.